My name is Samuel, though most folks, especially my dad, just call me Sam. I was 12 the summer Dad decided we were finally going to tackle a real piece of the Appalachian Trail. He'd been talking about it for years, ever since ever since it was just him and me. He had this old, dog-eared guidebook with faded pictures of misty mountains and smiling, sun-weathered hikers. "This is it, Sammy," he'd said, his voice full of a forced cheerfulness I'd grown used to. Man against nature. Character-building stuff. Dad, whose name is Tom, always fancied himself an outdoorsman, a survivor. He'd read all the books, watched all the shows. In reality, his longest solo trip had been a weekend camping at a state park with flushing toilets. But this, the AT, this was his Everest. He'd meticulously planned a 3-day loop in a quieter, less trafficked section of the trail in northern Georgia, promising moderate climbs and stunning vistas. We started on a bright, crisp morning. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a clean, wild scent that made me feel a little bit like those adventurers in Dad's books. The trail was a well-defined ribbon of packed dirt, winding upwards through a cathedral of trees. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. For the first few hours, it was everything Dad had promised. He pointed out different types of trees, identified bird calls, mostly incorrectly I later learned, and hummed off key trail songs. The first sign of trouble, though I didn't recognize it as such then, came at a small, weathered notice board a few miles in. It was tacked to an old oak, almost swallowed by moss. Most of the notices were faded and peeling, but one, newer than the rest, was stark white with bold black letters. Nodisi Jenkins Shirartralspurcilacid. Unstable terrain, no access. Below it, someone had scrawled in faded marker, "Stick to the blazes. Trust the blazes." Dad squinted at it. Jenkins Creek Trail, he muttered, pulling out his own laminated map. Huh. According to this old forum I was on, that's a shortcut. Knocks off a good 3 miles and a nasty climb. Unstable terrain probably just means a bit rocky. They're always overly cautious. But it says closed, Dad, I said, a small knot tightening in my stomach. The way the trees crowded around that sign felt watchful. He just grinned that wide, confident grin that usually made me feel safe. But this time, it seemed a little too bright. Rules are for rookies, Sammy. Besides, where's the adventure in following the herd? We'll be at the shelter hours before anyone else. He winked, then shouldered his pack, and, without another look at the main trail's white blazes, pushed past the sign and onto a barely perceptible path veering off to the left. I hesitated. The main trail looked inviting, safe. The path Dad had chosen was little more than a deer track, already disappearing into shadow. "Dad! Come on, Sam!" "Don't be a stick," in the mud. Reluctantly, I followed. The air on this new path felt different, heavier. The cheerful sounds of the main trail faded behind us, replaced by a deeper, more profound silence, broken only by the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. The trees here were older, gnarled, their branches interwoven so tightly overhead that only slivers of sunlight reached the ground. Moss hung in thick, gray beards from their limbs. A couple of hours in, Dad's confidence started to fray. The shortcut was proven to be a relentless, steep ascent over loose rocks and tangled roots. His map, which he kept consulting with increasing frustration, didn't seem to match the terrain at all. Damn internet forums, he grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Probably some kid making it up. We stopped by a sluggish, tea-colored stream for water. Dad, despite my reminder about the purification tablets in his pack, just scooped water into his bottle. "Looks clean enough to me, son. All that natural filtration." He took a long swig. I used my tablets. As dusk began to bleed through the dense canopy, painting the woods in shades of purple and gray, the path vanished completely. One minute we were scrambling over a fallen log, the next we were standing in a small, suffocating clearing, surrounded by an unbroken wall of trees. There was no sign of a trail in any direction. Dad said, his voice a little too loud in the sudden stillness. "Just a minor setback. sun setting west, so that way, he pointed vaguely. It was then that I saw it, nestled at the base of a particularly twisted-looking pine, half hidden by ferns. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figure, no bigger than my hand. It looked like a person, but its limbs were too long, its head too round, and its eyes were just hollow, staring pits. It was weathered, as if it had been there for a very long time, yet there was no moss on it, no sign of decay. It felt wrong. "Dad, look," I whispered, pointing. He walked over, nudged it with his boot. Huh, some kind of weird whittling. Probably some local kids messing around. He didn't sound convinced. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands. His face was pale in the dimming light. A sound cut through the woods then, not a bird, not an animal I recognized. It was a low, guttural click, followed by a drawn-out, breathy whistle that seemed to come from all around us and nowhere at all. The temperature, which had been cooling, plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the air. Dad dropped the wooden figure as if it had burned him. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "All right, Sam," he said, his voice tight, a tremor running through it. "Time to make camp, right here. We'll figure this out in the morning." But as he fumbled with his pack, his eyes kept darting towards the impenetrable shadows that pressed in on our tiny clearing, towards the spot where the unsettling whistle had seemed to originate. The confidence was gone from his face, replaced by a raw, unfamiliar fear. And looking at him, the knot in my stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone of dread. He'd broken the rules, and now the woods, these ancient, silent woods, were making their own. Night fell like a suffocating blanket. Dad managed to get a small, sputtering fire going, but it pushed back the oppressive darkness by only a few feet, creating a tiny island of flickering light in an ocean of black. The strange whistling and clicking sounds had stopped as abruptly as they'd begun, leaving behind a silence so profound it hummed in my ears. Even the usual night chorus of insects and frogs was absent. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. Dad didn't talk much. He kept poking the fire with a stick, his gaze fixed on the flames, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. He tried his phone earlier. No signal. Damn it. And the compass, when he finally dug it out, seemed to spin erratically before settling in a direction that felt completely wrong. He'd muttered something about magnetic interference, but the excuse sounded hollow even to me. The truth was, we were lost, profoundly and terrifyingly lost, on a path that shouldn't exist, in a part of the woods that felt older and wilder than anything on his tourist map. He'd also been wrong about the water. Sometime after midnight, Dad woke up groaning, clutching his stomach. He spent a miserable hour retching into the bushes at the edge of our firelight. I offered him some of my purified water, but he just waved a weak hand, his face slick with sweat despite the unnatural chill in the air. "Just a bug," he gasped, but his voice was thin with a fear that had nothing to do with a stomach ache. He knew and I knew that getting sick out here, with no clear way back, was a death sentence. Sleep was impossible for me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the unseen distance, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept thinking about that little wooden figure, its hollow eyes. Had it been a warning? Or a marker? I imagined more of them out there in the dark, a silent, watching circle. Sometime before dawn, as the fire dwindled to glowing embers, I heard it again, the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps. Not Dad. He was curled up by the fire, shivering despite his sleeping bag. These steps were slow, measured, circling our camp just beyond the reach of the dying light. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to scream for Dad, but my throat was locked tight with terror. The footsteps paused, then faded away, leaving only that ringing, expectant silence. When the first gray light of morning finally filtered through the dense canopy, Dad was a wreck. His face was ashen, his eyes bloodshot. He barely had the strength to stand. "Where we need to move," he croaked, his bravado completely gone, replaced by a desperate urgency. "Follow the sun. East. Has to lead somewhere." But the sun was a pale, indistinct smear behind the thick clouds that had rolled in overnight, and the forest seemed to have rearranged itself. Trees that I thought I recognized from the day before were gone, or in different places. The small clearing we'd camped in now felt like a trap, the trees pressing in closer. We stumbled on for what felt like hours, Dad leaning heavily on a makeshift walking stick. He didn't talk about shortcuts anymore. He didn't talk about rules. He just pushed forward, his breath rasping, his eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. Around midday, we found the creek again, or another one just like it. And there, half submerged in the muddy bank, was another wooden figure, identical to the first, and a few feet further another. They were like grotesque breadcrumbs, leading us deeper into this labyrinth. Dad stopped, staring at them. No. This isn't right. This can't be right. He looked wildly around, as if expecting an answer from the silent trees. That's when we saw the campsite. Tucked into a small hollow, almost invisible until you were right upon it, was a modern nylon tent, its rainfly flapping idly in the faint breeze. A backpack lay beside it, and a small cooking pot sat on a cold, unlit camp stove. It looked like someone had just stepped away for a moment. "Hello." Dad called out, his voice hoarse but hopeful. "Anyone there?" Silence. A new, more specific kind of fear prickled at me. This wasn't just about being lost anymore. This felt predatory. Dad, with a surge of adrenaline, pushed through the undergrowth towards the tent. Maybe they have a map, a radio. He unzipped the tent flap and peered inside. I was a few feet behind him, my heart pounding. He was silent for a long moment. Then he made a choked sound, a strangled gasp, and stumbled back, his face a mask of utter horror. "Dad, what is it?" "What did you see?" I tried to push past him, but he grabbed my shoulders, his grip like iron. "Don't look, Sam." He rasped, his eyes wide and staring, not at the tent, but at something beyond it, something in the trees. "Don't look. We need to go. Now, run." He didn't have to tell me twice. The sheer, animal terror in his voice was more frightening than anything I could have imagined inside that tent. We turned and fled, crashing blindly through the undergrowth. The image of Dad's horrified face burned into my mind. We ran without direction, without thought, driven only by a primal need to escape whatever he had witnessed. Behind us, from the direction of the abandoned tent, I heard that sound again, the low, guttural click, followed by the long, breathy whistle. This time, it didn't sound like it was all around us. This time, it sounded like it was following, and it was getting closer. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs screamed in protest. Dad, despite his earlier sickness and exhaustion, found a desperate strength, pulling me along, his breath tearing from his chest in ragged gasps. The forest was a blur of greens and browns, branches whipping at our faces, roots tripping our feet. The clicking, whistling sound pursued us, a relentless metronome marking our panicked flight. It never seemed to get much closer, but it never faded either, a constant, unnerving presence at our backs. I didn't dare ask Dad what he'd seen in that tent. The look on his face had been enough. It was a look of someone who had gazed into an abyss and seen something truly monstrous staring back. Whatever it was now hunting us. The terrain grew steeper, rockier. We scrambled up a narrow ravine, loose stones clattering under our boots. At the top, we found ourselves on a narrow, precarious ridge. On one side, a sheer drop into a shadowed valley. On the other, the dense, unyielding forest. There was no easy way forward, no clear path of escape.
"This way,"
Dad panted, pointing along the ridge. It looked impossibly narrow, but it was the only option that wasn't straight back down into the clutches of our pursuer. The whistling sound echoed up from the valley below, closer now. It was as if the thing, whatever it was, knew where we were going was hurting us. We edged along the ridge, the wind whipping around us, threatening to pluck us from the narrow path. My legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. Several times, Dad had to grab me to keep me from slipping. His face was a grim, determined mask, but his eyes held a haunted, broken look. The arrogant rule breaker was gone, replaced by a man facing the terrifying consequences of his folly, with his son's life in his hands. The ridge eventually widened slightly, descending into a small, bowl-shaped depression choked with ancient, gnarled rhododendrons. And in the center of this depression stood a cabin. It wasn't on any map Dad had. It was old, impossibly old, built of dark, weathered logs, half swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. The roof sagged, and the single window was a dark, empty square, like a vacant eye. A thin tendril of smoke, almost invisible against the gray sky, curled from a crooked stone chimney. Someone was home. The clicking and whistling from behind us grew louder, more insistent. It was right at the edge of the ridge we'd just left. "In there!" Dad hissed, pushing me towards the cabin. "It's our only chance." The thought of entering that dark, ominous structure filled me with a fresh wave of dread, but the sounds behind us were even more terrifying. We stumbled towards the rough-hewn door. It was closed, but not locked. Dad pushed it open with a groan of protesting wood, and we practically fell inside. The interior was dark and smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. A single candle guttered on a rough wooden table, casting long, dancing shadows. By its meager light, I could see a stone fireplace where a low fire smoldered, a couple of crude stools, and a pile of furs in the corner that might have been a bed. And sitting on one of the stools, its back to us, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, wrapped in dark, ragged clothing. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge our entrance. "Hello." Dad managed, his voice cracking. "Where we need help, we're lost." The figure remained still for a long moment. Then, slowly, it began to turn. The clicking sound, I realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from the figure. As it turned, the candlelight caught its face, and I felt a scream die in my throat. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its skin was the color of wet clay, stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. Its eyes were large, perfectly round and black as pitch, reflecting the candlelight like polished obsidian. Its mouth was a lipless slit that stretched too wide across its narrow face. And as it fully faced us, it lifted a long, three-fingered hand, and from its throat came that awful, breathy whistle. Dad shoved me behind him. "Get back, Sam." The creature rose slowly to its feet, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the low ceiling. It took a step towards us, its movements jerky, unnatural. It was holding something in its other hand, one of those small, carved wooden figures. I don't know what happened to Dad then. Maybe it was the terror, or the guilt, or some last desperate surge of paternal instinct. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, primal fury, and launched himself at the creature. It was no contest. The creature swatted him aside with a sickening thud, like he was a rag doll. Dad hit the wall and crumpled to the floor, unmoving. The creature turned its black, empty eyes on me. It took another step, the whistling sound filling the small cabin, punctuated by those horrible clicks. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so absolute, it was a physical weight pressing down on me. This was it. This was the mortal danger Dad's foolishness had led us to. This was the price of not following the rules. Then something in me snapped. Maybe it was seeing Dad lying there, or maybe it was just the instinct to survive. I scrambled backwards, my eyes darting around the small, dim cabin. The window, it was small, but maybe the creature was almost upon me. I could smell its breath, cold and earthy, like a freshly opened grave. I threw myself at the window. It was boarded up from the outside, but the wood was rotten. I kicked, I clawed, I hammered at it with my fists. Wood splintered, nails shrieked. Behind me, the whistling intensified, a sound of growing impatience, or hunger. With a final, desperate kick, a section of the boards gave way. I squeezed through the narrow opening, a shower of rotten wood and dirt falling around me, and tumbled out onto the damp ground outside. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, the creature's whistling shriek echoing behind me. I ran until the cabin was lost in the trees, until the sounds faded, until my vision blurred and I collapsed, sobbing, at the edge of a stream I didn't recognize. Hours later, or maybe it was the next day, a pair of hikers found me. I was delirious, babbling about a cabin, a creature, and my father. They said I was miles off any marked trail, in an area known for its treacherous terrain and sudden fogs. They said there were no cabins like the one I described anywhere in that part of the park. They never found my dad. They searched for weeks. They found the abandoned tent, just as I'd described it, but what Dad had seen inside, they never said. Maybe it was too horrible to speak of. They found no trace of him, no sign of the cabin, no strange wooden figures. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Sometimes I still dream about that cabin, about those black, empty eyes, and the whistling sound. I wake up cold, my heart pounding, the smell of damp earth and old blood in my nostrils. They say I was lucky to survive, that I imagined most of it, a child's mind traumatized by being lost and seeing his father succumb to the wilderness. But I know what I saw. I know what Dad's broken rules led us to. And I know that somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains, on an unmarked path, there are things that wait for those who stray too far, for those who don't respect the ancient, unspoken laws of the wild. And they're always listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. My name is Michael Keene. As of 0800 hours on October 12th, I have officially assumed the duties of Park Ranger GS 00259 at Arkwood National Park. This transfer follows a 6-year tenure at Yosemite, a posting I valued immensely. However, due to personal matters requiring proximity to family on the East Coast, I requested a reassignment. The Office of Personnel Management, in its wisdom, assigned me to Archwood, a place I had, until recently, only known as a name on a list of federal park resources. My responsibilities, as per the position classification standard, remain consistent with my previous role to supervise and perform work in the conservation and use of park resources. This includes, but is not limited to, natural and cultural resource management, the operation of interpretive programs for the benefit of the visiting public, visitor protection services, and enforcement of laws and regulations pertinent to the Park Service. I am a man who believes in procedure, in the clear, delineated lines of authority and responsibility that allow us to safeguard these national treasures. There is a form for every incident, a protocol for every emergency. This structure is not just bureaucracy, it is the bedrock of order in the face of nature's inherent chaos. Archwood, I was told, is one of the more remote postings in the eastern United States. Nestled deep in the oldest parts of the Appalachian Mountains, it is a world away from the granite majesty of Yosemite. The final 20 miles of the drive were on an unpaved service road that seemed to shed the modern world with every turn. The ranger station itself is a relic, a sturdy, 2-story log structure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, updated over the decades, but still retaining an air of profound isolation. My predecessor, a man named Thompson, according to the transfer documents, had left the place in immaculate order. The generator was full, the radio equipment passed its diagnostics, and the supply pantry was stocked for the winter. The first day was spent in methodical routine. I conducted a full inventory, cross-referencing the physical assets with the station's logbook. I walked the perimeter, checking the shutters and the integrity of the bear-proof waste containers. The air here is different. It's heavy, thick with the smell of rich, damp earth and what can only be described as centuries of decay. The trees, towering oaks, maples, and hemlocks form what the trail guides call a green tunnel, and even in the bright afternoon sun, the forest floor was a tapestry of deep shadows. These mountains feel ancient in a way the Sierra Nevada never did. They feel less like rock and more like sleeping giants, their stony bones covered in a thin blanket of soil and trees. There is a silence here that is not merely an absence of noise, but a presence in itself. Profound, listening quiet that seems to absorb sound before it can travel far. It was in the late afternoon, as I was organizing the kitchen, that I found it. Taped to the inside of the upper cabinet, right next to the mugs, was a single sheet of yellowed legal paper, folded twice. The paper was soft, almost cloth-like from handling, and covered in a frantic, spidery handwriting. At the top, in thick, underlined letters, were the words things you ought to know. For your own good, I chuckled, assuming it was a list of local quirks, or perhaps a good-natured hazing from Ranger Thompson. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the small kitchen table to read it. 1. The generator needs to be checked at 2200. Not a minute before, not a minute after. Top it off if needed. 2. If you hear whistling at night, go inside and lock the door. That song isn't for you. 3. The trail camera on Ridge 4 sometimes picks up static. If you see a file with a corrupted timestamp, delete it without viewing. NVR try to recover it. 4. If you find animal remains with no visible wounds, leave them at the base of the large weeping willow by the creek. Do not report it. Do not try to figure out what killed it. 5. Some nights you might see lights over Brown Mountain. Don't watch them for more than a minute. They notice when you're looking. 6. If you get a call on the radio and it's just silence, say, the line is clear and hang up. Don't wait for a reply. 7. An EVR, use the emergency flare gun unless the fire is something you can see. 8. There is a set of stone stairs deep in the North Woods that doesn't lead anywhere. You've seen them on the map. Do not go near them. If a hiker reports them, tell them they are mistaken. Log it as a false report. 9. If you see a man with a face that looks wrong or blurry, do not make eye contact. He is not lost. He knows exactly where he is. Turn around and walk away. 10. Don't leave food out for the bears. Especially not the one that walks on 2 legs. I read the list twice. My initial amusement curdled into a kind of professional annoyance. This was precisely the sort of thing that gave rangers in remote posts a bad name, succumbing to isolation, spinning folk tales, and blurring the lines between superstition and safety protocol. The reference to the Brown Mountain lights was a known piece of local folklore, easily explained by atmospheric phenomena or distant vehicle lights. The stairs in the woods was a recurring theme in online horror stories, a modern urban legend for the digital age, and the rest. Vague, unhelpful, and frankly unprofessional. What if a hiker was genuinely in distress and I hung up because of some silent call? Rule. What if the blurry-faced man was a stroke victim in desperate need of medical attention? My job is to provide assistance, to investigate, to be a beacon of calm authority in the wilderness. These rules were a direct contradiction of my duties. They encouraged dereliction, misdirection, and the abandonment of the very people I was sworn to protect. I considered throwing the list away, but something stayed my hand. It was a curiosity, a relic of my predecessor's apparent decline into paranoia. I folded it carefully and tucked it into the back of the station's official logbook. Later that evening, I made my first formal entry. October 12th, 2030. All systems operational, station inventory complete. No unusual incidents to report. Predecessor left a list of unofficial protocols. Appears to be a mix of local folklore and potential stress-related ideation. Will adhere strictly to established NPS guidelines and procedures. The safety of the public and the integrity of park resources are paramount and cannot be compromised by unsubstantiated local legends. Keen M. Park Ranger. As I wrote, I felt a sense of satisfaction. I was reestablishing order. I was a professional, a man of science and regulation, in a place that had clearly gotten the better of my predecessor. I would not make the same mistakes. I would not let the silence and the shadows play tricks on my mind. Here, in Archwood, the rules were clear. They were written in federal code, printed in manuals, and backed by the full authority of the United States government. Those were the only rules that mattered. That night, the wind picked up, and the ancient trees around the station began to creak and groan like the timbers of a sinking ship. I dismissed the sounds, finished my coffee, and prepared for my first full day in the woods. I was confident. I was prepared. I was, in hindsight, a fool. The first official day of patrol began as expected. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of damp soil and pine. My agenda was straightforward: a full circuit of the park's primary northern loop, checking trail conditions, looking for signs of illegal trapping, and generally establishing a presence. I am, by nature and by training, a creature of habit and procedure. My predecessor's list of nonsensical rules was a footnote in my logbook, an amusing anecdote to perhaps share at a future regional meeting. but nothing more. My focus was on the tangible, the observable, the tasks outlined in the Park Ranger GS Ozo 25 position description. It was mid-morning when I made the first discovery. On the bank of a fast, running creek, half hidden in a thicket of rhododendron, lay the carcass of a large white-tailed deer. Standard procedure dictates a thorough examination and report. I unslung my pack and pulled on a pair of latex gloves. As I approached, a line from the yellowed paper surfaced in my mind, unbidden rule Fate 4. If you find animal remains with no visible wounds, leave them at the base of the large, weeping willow by the creek. Do not report it. I scanned the area. Sure enough, about 50 yards downstream, a massive weeping willow drooped over the water. A coincidence. I knelt by the deer. It was a healthy-looking buck, its coat sleek, its eyes glassy but clear. I spent 20 minutes performing a meticulous inspection. There were no puncture wounds, no signs of a predator attack, no bullet holes, no evidence of arrow or bolt. Its legs weren't broken from a fall. It was simply dead. I've seen animals die from disease, from freak accidents, from starvation. There is always a sign, a physical clue. Here, there was nothing. It was as if the life had just been neatly extracted from it. The professional in me documented the finding, took photographs, and logged the coordinates. The man standing alone in the deep woods felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. I did not move the carcass to the willow tree. I reported it as per federal guidelines. I continued my patrol, the silence of the forest pressing in. It's a different kind of quiet here than in Yosemite. The Sierra Nevada has a clean, vast silence. This is a heavy, listening silence, as if the trees and the moss and the ancient rock are holding their breath, waiting. My route took me toward the northern boundary into a section of old, growth forest marked on the map as largely undeveloped. And there, on the map, was the anomaly that corresponded with another of Thompson's rules, a small icon denoting a man-made structure with no label. Rule 88. There is a set of stone stairs deep in the north woods that doesn't lead anywhere. Do not go near them. My duty is to inventory and assess all park features, marked or unmarked. To ignore it would be negligent. I left the main trail and pushed through dense undergrowth, following my compass bearing. After a half hour of hiking, I found them. They were exactly as the urban legends describe it, a flight of stone stairs, perhaps 40 steps in total, rising from the forest floor and ending abruptly in midair. They were covered in moss and ancient grime, the stones expertly cut, but clearly centuries old. They led to nothing. There was no collapsed ruin, no foundation, no clearing, just more forest. It was a profound and unsettling violation of logic. Stairs are a tool of transition meant to connect a lower place to a higher one. These connected nothing to nowhere. I walked around them, touching the cold, damp stone. The air was still. No birds sang. I felt a powerful, irrational sense of being watched, of trespassing in a place I was not meant to be. I took a photo for the official record, my hand shaking slightly as I put the camera away. I wrote it off as a historical curiosity, a forgotten folly from some long, dead settler. But the explanation felt thin, a flimsy shield against a creeping dread. Back at the station that evening, the sun bled out of the sky, leaving the mountains in shades of bruised purple and black. I was finalizing my patrol report when the radio crackled to life. It wasn't the clean burst of a call from dispatch, but a hiss of empty air. Then silence. A dead channel. I waited. Rule Phase 6. If you get a call on the radio and it's just silence, say, the line is clear, and hang up. This was absurd. It could be a lost hiker with a failing battery, their last desperate attempt to make contact. This is Ranger Keene at Archwood Station. I have an open line with static. Please repeat your transmission. Over. I spoke with the calm, measured authority my training dictated. The only reply was the continued, profound silence. It felt different from an empty channel. It felt weighted, like a held breath. If you can hear me and are unable to transmit, try keying your microphone twice. Nothing. After 5 minutes of attempting to establish contact according to protocol, the line clicked off. I sat back, the silence of the room now feeling as charged as the one on the radio. A deep sense of unease washed over me. Had I done the right thing? Later, as I was cleaning my dinner plate, I heard it, a faint, melodic sound drifting on the night air. Whistling, I froze, every muscle tensed. Rule Fate 2. If you hear whistling at night, go inside and lock the door. That song isn't for you. I was already inside, but the sound made the sturdy log walls of the station feel paper thin. It wasn't a tune I recognized. It was intricate, with strange, lilting trills and deep, mournful notes that seemed to hang in the air. It sounded inhuman. The whistling moved around the station, a slow, deliberate circuit. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was a federal officer. I was armed. But my hand went to the deadbolt on the main door and twisted it. The solid thunk of the bolt sliding home was a small comfort. I crept to the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness beyond the station's porch light. I saw nothing but the swaying silhouettes of the trees. Then, as suddenly as it began, the whistling stopped. The ensuing silence was somehow worse, filled with a terrifying sense of anticipation. I tried to rationalize it. The wind. A strange bird. My own mind stressed and isolated, playing tricks on me. I needed to reassert control, to ground myself in the logical, the procedural. I looked at the clock. 21:55. My eyes fell on the list, which I'd left on the table. Rule V1. The generator needs to be checked at 2200. Not a minute before, not a minute after. A wave of defiant anger washed over me. This was the final absurdity. A diesel generator does not operate on magical timetables. I would check it now. I would prove to myself that these rules were the product of a lonely man's fractured psyche. I grabbed my high lumen flashlight, took a deep breath, and unlocked the door. The night air was frigid, and the darkness was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to swallow the light from the porch. The generator shed was 100 feet from the station. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching on the gravel path. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the tree line, the light cutting a sharp, white blade through the black. And then it stopped. The beam landed on a figure standing just at the edge of the woods. It was tall, impossibly so, and stood on two long legs. It was not a bear. It was not a man. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, to fit it into a known category. And then I saw its face, or rather, where its face should have been. It was a shifting, indistinct blur, like a photograph horribly out of focus. Rule Fate 9. If you see a man with a face that looks wrong or blurry, do not make eye contact. He is not lost. He knows exactly where he is. Turn around and walk away. My blood ran cold. My feet were rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at me to run, yet my professional duty to investigate, to understand, held me captive. The blurry-faced man did not move. He just stood there in the silent, listening darkness of Archwood Park, and he was looking right at me. Time, as a measurable concept, ceased to exist. My world compressed to the space between my own frantic heartbeats and the static figure at the edge of the woods. It was a violation of all known categories, a walking, breathing impossibility. My training, my years of service, every protocol I had ever memorized provided no framework for a man with a face that wasn't a face. It was a vortex, a smudge in the fabric of reality, and it was looking at me. Rule Fate 9. If you see a man with a face that looks wrong or blurry, do not make eye contact. The warning screamed in my mind, but it was too late. I had looked. I had been seen. A cold, analytical part of my brain, the part that writes incident reports and testifies in court, tried to assert itself. Subject is approximately 2 meters tall, bipedal, exhibiting no discernible facial features. Possible visual hallucination induced by stress and isolation. But I knew it wasn't a hallucination. The sheer presence of the thing was a weight on the air, a pressure against my senses. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound, but I felt a sense of profound, ancient scrutiny, as if I were a microbe being examined under a microscope. Turn around and walk away. The second part of the rule. My legs were leaden, my muscles locked in a primal freeze response. To turn my back on it felt like the most profound folly imaginable. But the alternative, to stand there until it decided to act, was unthinkable. With a surge of will that felt like tearing my own skin, I broke my gaze, focusing on the gravel path in front of me. I turned my movements stiff and robotic, and began to walk back toward the station. I did not run. Running felt like an admission of prey status. Every step was a deliberate, measured act of defiance against the terror that was screaming at me to flee. The 100-foot walk back to the cabin became the longest journey of my life. The night, which had been filled with the familiar sounds of wind and rustling leaves, was now utterly silent. Or perhaps the roaring in my ears simply drowned everything else out. I felt its gaze on my back, a physical weight that threatened to crush me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the porch, fumbled with the doorknob, and stumbled inside, slamming the heavy oak door and throwing the deadbolt with a crash that echoed in the sudden stillness. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. My professional composure was not just cracked, it was shattered. I slid down the door to the floor, my sidearm feeling like a useless toy against whatever was out there. After several minutes, I managed to get to my feet and stumbled to the kitchen table. I pulled the yellowed list from the logbook. It was no longer a relic of my predecessor's paranoia. It was a testament, a survival guide. I read it again, and this time the words were not suggestions, but commandments etched in fire. Rule 4, animal remains with no visible wounds. The deer, I had logged it, reported it, a violation. Rule 880, the stone stairs. I had approached them, photographed them, a violation. Rule 6C, the silent radio call. I had tried to respond to follow protocol, a violation. Rule 2, the whistling. I had locked the door, but I had listened. Rule 180, the generator. I had deliberately gone out at 21:55, 5 minutes early in a fit of professional pique, and it had been waiting for me. My arrogance, my rigid adherence to a set of rules designed for a world that apparently did not exist here, had led me directly into the path of these things. Thompson hadn't been crazy. He had been trying to survive. A flicker of movement outside the window caught my eye. I crept towards it, my heart in my throat. High above the dark silhouette of Brown Mountain, a series of glowing orbs danced in the sky. They pulsed with a soft, internal light, moving in silent, impossible patterns, drifting, hovering, then darting at incredible speeds. Rule 5. Some nights, you might see lights over Brown Mountain. Don't watch them for more than a minute. They notice when you're looking. I felt a strange pull, a hypnotic fascination, but the memory of the blurry face was still seared into my mind. I counted to 60, my lips moving silently, then tore my eyes away from the window, my skin crawling with the renewed sensation of being watched. I spent the next few hours in a state of vigilant terror, jumping at every creak of the old cabin. Sleep was an impossibility. Just after 0200, a new sound began, a loud rhythmic banging from the direction of the waste disposal area. It wasn't the sound of a foraging animal. It was heavy, metallic, and deliberate. Clang, scrape, binge. I crawled to the small window on the far side of the station that overlooked the bear-proof dumpsters. Peering through the glass, I saw it. A hulking shape silhouetted against the faint starlight. It was massive, far larger than any black bear in these mountains, and it was standing on 2 legs. It moved with a lurching, unnatural gait, tearing at the reinforced steel lid of a dumpster with thick, clawed hands. Rule 10. Don't leave food out for the bears. Especially not the one that walks on 2 legs. I shrank back from the window, my breath catching in my chest. It was methodically trying to get into the trash, a grotesque parody of a common raccoon, and the sheer, brutal strength it was exerting was terrifying. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, it felt less like a sunrise and more like a temporary ceasefire. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I had to maintain some semblance of my duties, if only to keep myself from completely breaking down. I powered on my station computer to download the data from the park's trail cameras, a routine task that now felt fraught with peril. I clicked through the files: a fox trotting down a path, a doe and her fawn, a raccoon. Normalcy. Then I got to the folder for Ridge 4. My blood ran cold. There it was. A single video file, timestamped with a string of corrupted characters 206188. Rule 3. If you see a file with a corrupted timestamp, delete it without viewing. Any EVAR try to recover it. My training, the very core of my professional identity, screamed at me to do the opposite. This was data, an anomaly. It needed to be analyzed, understood, reported. What if it was evidence of a poacher using a signal jammer? What if it was a clue to a missing hiker? But the list, Thompson's list, was just as loud in my head, and Ivar tried to recover it. I stared at the file name, my hand trembling on the mouse. My entire worldview had been appended in less than 24 hours. The man of science and regulation was at war with the terrified survivor. What unknown horror was contained in that file, so terrible that the only safe course of action was to pretend it never existed? With a choke sob, I clicked on the file and dragged it to the trash icon. I emptied the trash, then ran a secure delete function, erasing every trace of it from the system. The act was a surrender. I was no longer Ranger Keen, GSO 25-9. I was just a man in a wooden box, surrounded by things that defied explanation, and the only rules that mattered now were the ones written on a sheet of yellowed paper. I sat back, shaking, the silence of the station pressing in on me. I had to document this. I opened the official log. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but the formal language of reports felt like a foreign tongue. What could I possibly write? Observed bipedal ursine entity. Witnessed anomalous aerial phenomena. Erase corrupted data file based on unofficial, superstitious protocol. They would pull me for a psych evaluation. I typed deleted and typed again, finally settling on a single frantic line. October 13 U630. The rules are real. All of them. As I stared at the words on the screen, a new sound started. It was soft, rhythmic. Thump, thump. It came from the wall behind me. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't an animal scratching. It was the sound of something heavy and soft, patiently, deliberately, bumping against the outside of the cabin, as if testing the strength of the logs. And it didn't stop. The thumping against the log wall was soft, yet it resonated through the cabin like a heartbeat. Thump, thump. It was patient, methodical. Not the frantic scrabbling of an animal, but the deliberate testing of a structure by something that had all the time in the world. I remained frozen, a statue carved from fear, my back pressed against the opposite wall. My mind, once a fortress of regulations and scientific reason, was now a wasteland. The only thoughts that remained were the frantic, spidery words on the yellowed paper. The list was no longer a guide, it was the only reality. The thumping moved along the exterior of the station, a slow, investigative circuit. It paused at the window, and I held my breath, expecting the glass to shatter. But it didn't. The sound simply moved on, continuing its patient, rhythmic probing. I was prey in a box, and the predator was inspecting the trap. The night stretched into an eternity of listening, every creak of the old building a potential prelude to annihilation. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. I sat at the kitchen table, the useless weight of my service pistol on my hip, my gaze fixed on the list as if it were a holy text that could somehow ward off the encroaching darkness. When dawn finally broke, it brought no relief, only a gray, washed-out light that made the world look sick and tired. The thumping had stopped hours ago, but the silence it left behind was heavy with menace. I was a prisoner. To flee into the woods was to run into the arms of the things that hunted there. To stay was to wait for the walls to finally give way. My professional training was a mockery. What good was a course on visitor protection against a thing with a blurry face? What was the protocol for a bear that walked on two legs and had the strength to peel steel? It was then that I heard it. A new sound, piercing the morning quiet. It was the sound of a child crying. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a faint, looping cry like the one from the Sarah story I'd once heard. This sounded real, desperate, and achingly human. It came from the direction of the creek, somewhere deep in the woods. Every instinct, every fiber of my being as a park ranger, screamed at me to respond. This was my core function: to render aid, to protect the vulnerable. I remembered the case file from my predecessor's time, the little boy taken by the bear man, who had a weird face. Was this another child, another victim? I grabbed the radio, my hands shaking. Archwood Station to dispatch. Do you copy? Static. Only static. I tried again, my voice cracking. This is Ranger Keene. I have a possible child in distress, requesting immediate assistance. Over. The silence that answered was absolute, a void that swallowed my words. I was alone, utterly and completely alone. The crying grew louder, more insistent. It was a sound of pure terror and pain, a sound designed to trigger an immediate, protective response in any decent human being. I looked at the list. There was no rule for a crying child. It was an unforeseen variable, a test that fell outside the established parameters of this nightmare. My mind raced, trying to find a loophole, a justification. My duty was clear, but the woods were not. My eyes fell on the emergency kit mounted on the wall. Inside, nestled in its foam casing, was the flare gun, and the final, untested rule slammed into my consciousness: Rule Phase 7. Never use the emergency flare gun unless the fire is something you can see. The conflict was a physical agony. To abandon a child was to abandon my oath, my very identity. But to break a rule on this list, every violation so far had led to a more direct, more terrifying consequence. The crying became a wail, a raw plea for help that tore at my soul. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and let a child die. A desperate rationalization formed in my shattered mind. A fire you can see. An emergency is a fire. A child in mortal danger is the biggest fire of all. I could see it in my mind, a clear and present blaze that I was duty bound to extinguish. It was a flimsy argument, a lawyer's trick played on the devil, but it was all I had. With a guttural cry, I grabbed the kit, ripped open the latch, and seized the flare gun. I burst out of the station door, the cold morning air hitting my face. The child's cries seemed to come from everywhere at once now. I didn't hesitate. I raised the pistol to the sky, pulled the trigger, and fired. A brilliant red star shot into the air, leaving a trail of smoke. It reached its apex and hung there for a moment, a beautiful, defiant symbol of hope against the oppressive gray sky. And the crying stopped. For a single blessed second, there was silence. A profound, peaceful quiet. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I had done it. I had acted. I had chosen humanity over fear. Then the new sound began. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come not from the woods, but from the sky itself. It grew in intensity, vibrating in my bones, in my teeth. I looked up. The lights I had seen over Brown Mountain were back, but they were not distant anymore. They were descending, dozens of them, glowing orbs of silent, cold light converging on my position. The flare hadn't been a call for help. It was a beacon, a dinner bell. The fire you can see, the horrifying, literal truth crashed down on me. The flare was a fire. I had lit a fire in the sky, and now they could see it. They descended into the clearing around the station, silent and terrible. In the cold alien light, the blurry faced man was there, standing impassively at the edge of the trees. The bipedal bear emerged from the shadows, its claws scraping softly on the rock. And there were others, shapes that twisted and broke the laws of geometry, things that my mind refused to fully process. They were not of this world. They were the reason for the rules. The rules weren't a defense. They were a treaty, a list of ways to avoid notice. And I had just announced my presence to all of them. With the last dregs of my adrenaline, I scrambled back inside the station, slamming and bolting the door. The hum was deafening now. The entire cabin began to vibrate. The light pouring through the windows was blinding. I knew the walls wouldn't hold. I knew I was already dead. But there was one last thing I had to do, one final act of a park ranger. I lunged for the logbook, for the yellowed paper tucked inside. I grabbed a pen, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and scrawled a final entry, a last desperate warning to whoever came next. October 14th, 09:15. The rules are real, all of them. I broke Rule 7. The flare is the fire. It's not a signal. It's a summons. They see it. They come for it. Don't make my mistake. My name is Dr. Elias Thorne. I hold a doctorate in forest ecology from Colorado State University, with a postdoctoral focus on disturbance-driven ecosystems, particularly pyrophytic succession in the Southern Rockies ecoregion. This document is not a plea for help, nor is it a confession whispered from a padded cell. It is a report. It is the final and only truthful account of the events that transpired during my assignment in the Uncompahgre, Pike Consolidated District from October to November of 2024. I have been deemed psychologically unfit for duty, my meticulously recorded findings dismissed as trauma-induced fantasy, the product of isolation and a mind unmoored. But the data does not lie. The measurements, the photographs, the coordinates, they are immutable. I am presenting my findings here exactly as I recorded them in my field journal before they are systematically buried under the weight of official denial and redacted into oblivion. My mission, on paper, was straightforward and, to me, deeply fulfilling: to conduct a multi-year ecological survey within a designated burn scar, a vast wound in the landscape left by the Hayman fire years prior. The U.S. Forest Service required a comprehensive analysis of vegetation regrowth and faunal repopulation across several critical elevation zones. My study area was a remote, rugged section of the Pike National Forest, a place of dramatic verticality where the land climbs from the rolling foothills at 7,000 feet to the start, wind-scarred peaks approaching 12,000 feet. It is a world stratified by altitude, a living laboratory of ecological succession. The lower elevations are characterized by open ponderosa pine savannas, their long taproots anchoring them in the dry, windswept soil, their bark smelling faintly of vanilla in the warm afternoon sun. They are resilient, fire-adapted giants. Higher up, these give way to dense, almost claustrophobic stands of lodgepole pine, a forest born of fire, their serotinous cones waiting patiently for the heat that will release their seeds and begin the cycle in you. Above 9,000 feet, you enter the subalpine zone of dark, primeval world of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, where the air grows thin and cold, and the forest floor is a deep, damp carpet of fallen needles. Here, snowpack can persist in shaded hollows well into the summer, and the silence is so profound it feels like a physical presence. It is a landscape of profound beauty and unforgiving harshness, a mosaic of life zones dictated by elevation, aspect, and the brutal whims of climate. My job was to quantify this recovery, to translate the forest's slow, silent, and tenacious rebirth into charts, figures, and peer-reviewed papers. I was a man of science, of empirical observation. I believed that everything, given enough study, could be measured, categorized, and ultimately explained. The first 2 weeks were a balm to my soul, a routine of demanding physical labor and mental peace. I established my base camp in a small, isolated Forest Service cabin, a sturdy but lonely structure of peeled logs and a green metal roof, and began the arduous task of laying out my transect lines. The work was a familiar meditation, driving steel posts into the rocky soil, stretching a surveyor's tape between them, and meticulously documenting every plant, every track, every sign of life within the prescribed area. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind in the pines and the distant, territorial call of a Steller's jay. The initial anomalies were subtle, easily dismissed as quirks of the wilderness. On the 3rd of October, I hiked to Transect 7, a line of marked steel posts running through a recovering stand of quaking aspen. The 7th marker post, a 40-pound piece of steel I had pounded 2 feet into the ground myself, had been moved. It was not bent or knocked over. As if by a curious bear or a winter blowdown, it had been pulled cleanly from the earth and placed, with impossible care, 15 meters to the west. Around its base, a collection of milky quartz stones, gathered from a nearby creek bed, had been arranged in a neat, deliberate spiral. I cursed the thought of local vandals, logged it as such, and spent an irritated hour resetting the post, my scientific serenity momentarily disturbed. The first carcass appeared a week later, and with it, the first true tremor of cognitive dissonance. It was a mature bull elk, discovered in a high meadow of late, blooming wildflowers near the edge of the subalpine zone. From a distance, it looked as if it were merely sleeping in the sun. As I drew closer, the wrongness of the scene became a physical pressure against my skin, a cold knot in my stomach. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn earth, no broken branches, no tracks, not from a mountain lion, not from a bear, not even the scuffed hoof prints of the elk itself. Most unnervingly, there was no blood. The ground beneath the animal carpet of Indian paintbrush and lupine, was pristine. The wound itself was a masterpiece of grotesque precision. The soft tissue from the jaw to the upper neck, including the tongue and larynx, had been excised, removed. The cut was a clean, almost cauterized line, exposing the white bone of the mandible. It looked less like the work of a predator and more like a surgical procedure, performed with an instrument of impossible sharpness and heat. It was reminiscent of the lurid tales I'd heard from the San Luis Valley, stories of mutilated cattle and a horse named Snippy, which I had always dismissed as rural folklore. Over the next 10 days, I found 2 more, a doe and a yearling, in different locations but in the exact same state of bloodless surgical mutilation. The sights shared an eerie, uniform quality, an unnatural, sterile silence. No birds sang in the surrounding trees. No squirrels chattered from the branches. The ubiquitous forest scavengers, coyotes, vultures, even the carrion beetles and flies, were conspicuously absent. It was as if a sterile bubble had been placed over these locations, preserving them in a state of perfect, morbid stillness. My scientific mind reeled, desperately searching for a rational cause. A new, highly localized pathogen that caused rapid, bloodless decay. A typical predation by an unknown animal with an unheard of method of killing. Ritualistic activity by a local cult, perhaps one of the fringe groups rumored to inhabit the woods around Manitou Springs, a place with its own strange legends of witches and animal remains. Every hypothesis crumbled against the sheer, defiant impossibility of the evidence. To process the growing cognitive dissonance, to try and force the phenomena back into the neat boxes of my worldview, I began a formal anomaly log in my field journal. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos, but the entries only chronicled my descent into the inexplicable. The first entry, on October 3rd, noted the moved transect marker T7, now surrounded by a precise spiral of rocks. I'd labeled it as potential vandalism, but the anomalous factors were glaring no tracks, human or animal, and the 40-pound post had been pulled cleanly from the earth. Then came the carcasses. On October 9th, I logged the first bull elk, hypothesizing in a typical poacher or an unknown predator, yet the evidence defied this. There was no blood spatter, no entry wound, no tracks of any kind, and a complete, unnatural absence of scavengers. By October 12th, I had found 2 more identically mutilated elk, a doe and a yearling. I speculated about a fast-acting pathogen or even ritualistic activity by a cult, but the sheer precision of the cuts and the continued lack of any human evidence rendered these ideas useless. The log did not help. It only served to starkly illustrate the failure of my framework. The impossibility escalated on October 15th, when all 10 markers on Transect 7 were rearranged overnight into a large, complex geometric pattern resembling a starburst. A coordinated team would have been required, working for hours in the dark, yet they left no tire tracks on the access road, not a single footprint. The final entry before I stopped writing was from October 17th. One of my subterranean soil probes, buried 30 centimeters deep, recorded an instantaneous temperature spiked to 150 degrees Celsius at 2:14 a.m. The event lasted 3.2 seconds. It was a localized, inexplicable burst of intense energy, as there had been no storm and no other probes were affected. This catalog of impossibilities mocked my attempts at rational explanation. The world I knew, a world governed by predictable physical laws and biological imperatives, was beginning to fray at the edges, unraveling like a poorly woven tapestry. I felt a new kind of cold settle deep into my bones, one that had nothing to do with the falling autumn temperatures and the shortening days. It was the cold, primal dread of realizing you are not merely an observer of a system, but a tiny, insignificant component within a system that is actively, intelligently, and silently observing you back. The profound silence of the ponderosa pines was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. The phenomena escalated, shifting their focus. They moved from the tangible, static evidence of carcasses and moved markers to a direct and sustained assault on my senses, a psychological siege designed to dismantle my sanity piece by piece. The attacks began at night. Alone in my cabin, miles from any other human soul, Surrounded by an ocean of black forest, I started to hear things. At first, it was a faint, discordant melody that seemed to drift on the wind, like the sound of a distant orchestra tuning up in a vast, empty concert hall. I would stand at the cabin's single pane window, peering into the impenetrable blackness of the spruce forest, my breath fogging the cold glass, trying to locate a source. A radio. Late-night campers with peculiar taste in music. But the sound was too clean, too ethereal, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. A non-localized acoustic anomaly that defied the physics of sound propagation. It was the exact type of auditory hallucination reported by the Lee family in the infamous Black Forest haunting, a case I'd read about with detached, academic curiosity. Then came the metallic sounds. A heavy, rhythmic rattling, like someone dragging immense, rusted chains across the granite bedrock of the mountainside. It was a sound from another age, a sound of dungeons and medieval ghosts, utterly alien to this wilderness of pine and stone. I would lie in my bunk, rigid, my muscles clenched, listening to it echo through the canyons for minutes at a time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But the worst sound, the one that scraped at the deepest, most primal parts of my brain, was the scream. It would erupt from the darkness without warning, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the night. It was not the cry of any known animal in North America. It was a horrifying hybrid, a fusion of a woman's terrified, piercing shriek and the guttural, predatory roar of a large carnivore. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and incandescent rage, and it echoed for what felt like an eternity before being abruptly swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. During the day, the auditory assault was replaced by a crushing, psychic weight. A constant, prickling sensation of being watched. I'd be kneeling to check a soil moisture sensor or documenting the regrowth of fireweed, and the feeling would descend upon me like a shroud. A cold, absolute certainty that unseen eyes were following my every move from the dense, shadowy cover of the trees. I started finding things on the rough, hewn porch of my cabin small. Strange offerings left during the night. A perfectly spherical river stone, polished to a glassy smoothness beyond what any natural tumbling could achieve. A ride-scent raven feather placed dead center on my doormat. A small, intricately carved piece of wood that looked vaguely like a stylized human figure, its proportions unsettlingly long and thin. They were not overtly threatening, but they were deeply, profoundly unsettling, messages from an unknown and unknowable intelligence. After a week of this relentless psychological warfare, I was fraying. Sleep, deprived and perpetually on edge, my scientific objectivity shattered. I drove my Forest Service truck down the winding, corrugated dirt road to the nearest town. A small, historic place called Alma, clinging precariously to the side of the mountains. I needed supplies, but more than that, I needed the reassuring presence of other people, the mundane noise of civilization, to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. Seeking some context, anything to anchor my experiences in a shared reality, I visited the town's small, dusty mining museum and historical society. The archives were a cramped back room, smelling of decaying paper and time, a collection of settler diaries, mining company ledgers, and brittle local newspapers dating back to the 1880s. What I found there did not comfort me. It terrified me, because it validated my experiences. I found stories of my forest, stories that mirrored my own with chilling, uncanny accuracy. An 1890s article from a defunct newspaper, the Park County Prospector, spoke of a creature the lumberjacks called the Slide Rock Bolter, a ravenous monster of local folklore said to inhabit the steepest slopes, blamed for the mysterious disappearance of tools, supplies, and occasionally livestock. Miners' journals from the turn of the century were filled with hushed, fearful accounts of Tommy knockers, mischievous or malevolent spirits they blamed for strange knocking sounds deep within the earth. Sounds that sometimes warned of cave-ins or sometimes seemed to lure men towards collapsed tunnels and their doom. Then I found the file. It was a thin, manila folder tucked away in a box of miscellaneous county records, simply labeled Unexplained Disappearances, Pike District. Inside were brittle, yellowed reports typed on manual typewriters. A family of 4 vanished from their locked cabin in the winter of 1888, leaving a full, steaming dinner on the table. A prospector named Silas Kane, who went looking for a hidden gold mine in the Flatirons and was never seen again, his mule found wandering weeks later, its saddlebags empty. And then, the one that made my blood run cold, a 4-year-old boy named Alfred Balehartz, who disappeared from a family picnic near Fall River in 1938. The search was one of the largest in the state's history. The detail that seized my attention was a witness report from 2 hikers who, days later, claimed to have seen a small boy high on an inaccessible, sheer rock ledge they called the Devil's Nest. The reports noted a disturbing pattern, one that researcher David Paulides would later codify and name missing Fort 11s. The victims often vanished near boulder fields or creeks in areas of significant Native American importance, places the Ute tribes considered sacred or taboo. My cabin, my base of operations, was less than 2 miles from a large, glacial boulder field situated right next to Tarryall Creek. In a box of miscellaneous historical pamphlets, I found one published by a local Ute cultural group. It was poorly translated, but its message was stark and clear. It spoke of the mountains not as inert rock, but as sacred, living beings. It warned against disturbing certain valleys and canyons, which it called places of emergence, where the veil between the spirit world and the physical world was thin. It spoke of a tragedy at Grand Lake, where the spirits of drowned Ute women and children were said to wail beneath the winter ice, a place the Utes considered bad medicine and avoided for generations. My study area, I realized with a jolt of ice, water dread, was not just a recovering ecosystem. It was considered sacred, forbidden ground. I drove back to my cabin as dusk was falling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of folklore, history, and encroaching fear. I pulled over at a scenic overlook to watch the last rays of sun paint the jagged peaks in hues of incandescent orange and deep purple. The landscape was etchingly beautiful, but it no longer felt benign or neutral. It felt ancient, aware, and predatory. And that's when I saw it. On a high, distant ridge silhouetted against the fading, bruised twilight, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly so, and stick-thin, its limbs elongated and angular. It was not a man, not a bear, not a deer. It moved with a swift, disjointed, unnatural gait, like a broken marionette or a glitching frame in a film. It took 2 long, loping strides that covered an impossible distance, and then it simply vanished over the crest of the ridge. The sighting lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it was absolute, burned onto my retinas. My scientific skepticism, my carefully constructed worldview, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I was no longer dealing with vandals or strange weather patterns or my own fracturing psyche. I was dealing with a thing, and it knew I was here. The sighting of the figure on the ridge changed everything. The detached curiosity of the scientist was gone, burned away by a white, hot flash of primal fear. It was replaced by the gnawing, visceral terror of prey that has finally seen its predator. But fear is a powerful catalyst. It can paralyze or it can propel. For me, it clarified. The scattered, terrifying phenomena were no longer random. They were pieces of a puzzle, and I now held the central, connecting piece. My rational mind, though battered and bruised, latched onto the one tangible clue from my frantic research in the Alma archives. Devil's Nest, the name of the inaccessible ledge where the lost boy, Alfred Balehartz, was supposedly seen in 1938. I spread my topographical maps across the cabin's small table, my hands shaking slightly. There it was. A deep, isolated, and unnamed canyon in the most remote sector of my study area, but scrawled in faint pencil on this old Forest Service map was the same name, Devil's Nest. It was the epicenter. I knew, with a chilling certainty that defied logic and reason, that all the phenomena, the surgically precise carcasses, the impossible sounds, the watchful silence, the stick, thin figure, emanated from that place. I had to go there. I packed a light but essential kit, extra water, high-energy rations, my GPS unit, a reliable magnetic compass, a headlamp, and my geology hammer, its weight a small comfort in my hand. I set out at dawn, the air crisp and cold, under a sky the color of steel. The hike into the canyon was a descent into another world, a journey backward in time. As I dropped in elevation, the familiar ponderosa and lodgepole pines of the montane zone gave way to an ancient, towering forest of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. Their branches, heavy with thick, green moss, intertwined overhead, blocking out the sun and creating a perpetual, gloomy twilight on the forest floor. The temperature plummeted, a sudden, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the altitude or the shade. My breath plumed in front of my face in thick, white clouds. Then, my equipment, my tethers to the modern, rational world, began to fail. The screen on my GPS flickered erratically, displaying a scramble of nonsensical characters before going completely dead. I pulled out my compass. The needle, instead of pointing resolutely north, spun uselessly, rotating in slow, lazy circles as if searching for a pole that no longer existed. I was navigating by instinct alone, drawn deeper into the canyon by a force I couldn't explain. The trees themselves seemed warped and diseased, their trunks twisted into agonized, spiraling shapes, as if they had grown in a place where the laws of physics were bent. It was then that I began to see the lights. At first, they were faint, ephemeral pulses in my peripheral vision, easily dismissed as phosphenes from exhaustion. But as I went deeper, they became bold and distinct, shimmering, silent orbs of cobalt blue, emerald green, and blood red light that danced and weaved between the ancient trees. They moved with a silent, intelligent purpose, weaving intricate, geometric patterns in the gloom, sometimes hovering motionless before darting away into the shadows. I remembered reading the account of the Lee family who experienced a terrifying haunting in the Black Forest. They described flashing lights like the 4th of July in their living room, phenomena a Hopi shaman had attributed to something he called a rainbow vortex, a gateway, a place where the membrane between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin and permeable. I was walking through that vortex now. The air itself felt thick and heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. A low, subsonic hum vibrated up through the soles of my boots, a sound I felt in my bones and teeth more than I heard with my ears. After what felt like hours of navigating this disorienting, luminous landscape, I reached the canyon floor. The sight that greeted me stopped me dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the valley was a perfect circle of barren, scorched earth, roughly 50 meters in diameter. Not a single blade of grass, not a single weed, not even a patch of moss grew within its sharply defined boundary. The air inside the circle shimmered with a visible, heatless energy, and the low hum was now a palpable, physical force that made my vision vibrate at the edges. And in the absolute center of the circle stood the source. It was a monolith, a 10-foot tall, perfectly smooth, metallic rectangle, its surface a polished, non-reflective black that seemed to drink the dim light around it, creating a void in space. It was utterly featureless, seamless, and cold to the touch. It was identical in description to the mysterious object that had recently appeared and disappeared on a hill near Fort Collins, an object that had baffled the media and authorities before it was quietly removed. But this was no modern art installation or college prank. This felt ancient eternal. It was a machine. It was a term away. I knew with a sudden, terrifying clarity that bypassed all my years of scientific training and logical deduction what this place was. This was the Sipapu, the place of emergence from the old Ute and Navajo legends I had read about, the place where they believed their ancestors were led underground by people to escape a great cataclysm, the place where the star people were said to enter our reality aboard flying seed pods. It wasn't a myth. It was a physical location, a functioning terminal between worlds, and it was active. As the sun began to set, its last rays unable to penetrate the deep canyon, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley, the monolith began to thrum with greater intensity. The hum rose in pitch, becoming a low resonant tone. And then they emerged. They did not come from the monolith itself, but materialized from the deepest shadows at the edge of the clearing, drawn to the structure's energy like nocturnal insects to a bug zapper. My mind, my poor, scientifically trained human mind, struggled to categorize the impossible parade of creatures that shambled, skittered, and strode into the open. There was a hulking, bipedal form covered in shaggy, dark hair, its massive shoulders slumped as it moved with a surprisingly fluid, silent grace. Its sheer size and ape, like shape, were unmistakable. A Sasquatch, a creature of campfire stories and grainy photographs, real and solid and smelling of damp earth and musk. Behind it, two gaunt, pale figures moved with the same disjointed, stop-motion speed as the thing I had seen on the ridge. Their limbs were too long, their joints seemed to bend at impossible, backward angles. Skinwalkers, the shapeshifters of nightmare legend, their eyes black and devoid of any light or soul. From the gnarled roots of the ancient spruce trees, a group of small, twisted humanoids scurried forth, their eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent phosphorescence. They were bent, monstrous caricatures of the wee tricksters, the old Cornish miners called Tommyknockers, their faces wizened and cruel. And there were others, things made of shadow and flickering light, things that defied geometry, things for which my language, our language, had no words. They were not a pack or a herd. They were a collection, a horrifying menagerie of Colorado's darkest legends and cryptids, all gathered in one impossible place. They ignored me completely, their attention fixed on the humming monolith, as if waiting for a signal, waiting for the door to fully open. In that moment of pure, undiluted terror, I understood. The legends weren't separate stories. They were all true, all facets of a single, horrifying, intersecting reality. This valley wasn't haunted. It was a habitat. And I was trespassing. I was crouched behind a large, moss-covered boulder at the edge of the clearing, my body frozen in a state of absolute terror, my mind screaming. The creatures continued their silent, patient vigil around the humming black monolith, a congregation of impossibilities under the deepening twilight. The air grew colder, the resonant tone from the black slab deepening in pitch, vibrating in my chest cavity. I don't know how long I watched them, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing me into the earth. An hour, a lifetime, then a single, fatal mistake. Shifting my weight to relieve a cramping muscle, my boot dislodged a small, loose stone. It skittered across the face of the boulder and landed on the barren, scorched earth of the clearing with a soft click. The sound was insignificant, a tiny punctuation mark in the vast wilderness. Yet in the charged, humming silence of that valley, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head turned. Every pair of glowing black or multi-faced eyes snapped towards my hiding place in perfect, horrifying unison. The collective weight of their attention was a physical blow, a wave of malevolence that struck me with the force of a hurricane. The hunt began. I scrambled backwards, crab walking away from the boulder, then turned and ran, my lungs screaming for air that felt too thin to sustain life. The forest that had been merely unsettling on the way down was now actively, malevolently hostile. The faint path I had followed was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Trees seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, their low, hanging branches grabbing at my clothes like skeletal hands. The ground itself became treacherous, roots snaking out from the earth to trip me, rocks turning under my feet. I felt a profound sense of temporal distortion, a waking nightmare. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, yet the sliver of moon remained fixed in the sky, refusing to move. It was the legend of Boulder's enchanted mesa, made terrifyingly real, a place where time itself became a fluid, predatory trap. Behind me, I could hear them coming, the heavy, thudding footfalls of the Sasquatch crashing through the undergrowth, the dry, skittering sounds of the smaller, gnarled creatures, and worst of all, that horrifying, part human, part animal screech echoing through the twisted trees, a sound of pure, murderous rage. I was not going to outrun them. I was not going to outfight them. My only hope, my only chance at survival was to outthink them. My panicked mind, in a moment of desperate clarity, latched onto my training, my knowledge of the land. I remembered the geology of the region's steep, unstable scree slopes, a consequence of the rapid tectonic uplift of the Rockies. The canyon I had descended was a natural bottleneck, its walls sheer and fractured. An idea born of pure desperation formed in my mind. I veered off my frantic, pathless flight, scrambling directly up a steep, loose rock face, pulling myself upward with bleeding hands. The creatures followed, their unnatural agility allowing them to scale the treacherous incline with terrifying ease. I could hear them closing the distance. I reached a point just below the canyon rim, a section of heavily fractured granite and loose shale I had noted on my way down as being dangerously unstable. I pulled my geology hammer from my belt. With the last of my adrenaline-fueled strength, I began striking at the key stress points in the rock face, the sound of steel on stone ringing out like a frantic alarm bell in the night. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the heart of the mountain itself, the rock face began to move. A cascade of small rocks turned into an avalanche of massive boulders, a roaring, grinding river of stone and earth that poured down into the narrow canyon entrance below. I heard a final, collective screech of fury and frustration from the darkness before it was abruptly cut off by the deafening thunder of the landslide. I had buried the valley. I had sealed the door. I stumbled through the wilderness for 2 more days, delirious from exhaustion, dehydration, and profound shock. A pair of hikers found me on a roadside, miles from my truck, my clothes torn, my face and hands bloody, rambling incoherently about monoliths and monsters in a place called Devil's Nest. My official debriefing with my superiors at the Forest Service was a quiet, humiliating disaster. I presented my logbook, my frantic sketches of the creatures, my soil temperature data, my disjointed but earnest report. They listened with polite, pitying expressions, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The official conclusion, typed up and placed in my permanent file, was trauma-induced psychosis, brought on by prolonged isolation and high-altitude stress. I was placed on indefinite medical leave. My career, my life's work, over in an instant. The day before I was scheduled to be driven off the mountain, 2 men visited my cabin. They were not from the Forest Service. They wore plain, dark, ill-fitting suits that looked utterly out of place in the rustic setting. They didn't ask about my mental state or offer condolences. They asked very specific, very calm, and very unnerving questions. Dr. Thorne, the first one said, his eyes cold and analytical, described the sound the monolith made. Was it a steady hum, or did it pulse at a measurable frequency? The second one asked, his voice devoid of emotion, the lights you saw in the canyon. Did they react to your presence, or did they follow a predetermined path? They listened intently to my answers, nodding slowly, making no notes. They suggested, in a placid, reasonable tone that was more terrifying than any scream, that what I had experienced might have been the result of unconventional atmospheric testing from one of the nearby military installations, or perhaps a mass hallucination induced by localized infrasound phenomena from geological instability. Their calm, knowing denial was more chilling than the screech of any creature. They were not there to debunk my story. They were there to contain it. They confiscated my journal, my samples, and every photograph I had taken, citing national security. I am writing this now, years later, from a small, rented house in a flat, featureless landscape, as far from the mountains and their watchful silence as I can get. I no longer look at a forest and see an ecosystem of trees and animals. I see a veil. My final conclusion, the one I could not put in my official report, the one that keeps me awake at night, is this: all of it is true. The Ute legends of the Sipapu and the Star People in their flying seed pods. The settlers' tales of the Slide, Rock Bolter, and the Tommy Knockers. The modern accounts of Bigfoot sightings, of surgically mutilated cattle, of the strange, dancing lights over the San Luis Valley, of the ghosts on Riverdale Road, and the witches of Manitou. They are not separate myths. They are different people from different centuries with different languages and belief systems, all trying to describe the same fundamental, impossible, and terrifying truth. There are places in this world, deep in the ancient forests of Colorado, where our reality wears thin. These are not places that are haunted by the spirits of the dead. They are places that are inhabited by another kind of life, a complete and parallel ecosystem that operates by a different set of physical and biological laws, one that sometimes bleeds through into our own. I did not discover a monster. I stumbled into a habitat. I escaped, and I sealed one of its entrances. But I know the monolith is still there, humming in the eternal dark beneath 1,000,000 tons of rock, and I know that the deep, profound silence of the ponderosa pines is not empty. It is waiting. My name is Elias Vance. It is a name that has been signed on countless incident reports, etched onto brass plaques at ranger stations from the misty peaks of the Appalachians to the sun-scorched canyons of the Southwest, and spoken with quiet respect, I hope, by those I've had the privilege to serve alongside. For a decade, I have worn the uniform of the National Park Service, a calling that has demanded proficiency in wilderness survival, the grim arts of search and rescue, and the meticulous stewardship of our nation's natural resources. It is a life of quiet dedication, a commitment to the preservation of those few wild spaces left untamed by the relentless march of concrete and commerce. This dedication, this yearning for the profound silence and untamed heart of the wilderness, has now led me to the ultimate Crucible Denali National Park and Preserve in Alaska. I sought this assignment, sought the isolation and the challenge. There's a certain allure to Alaska, what many call the last frontier. Perhaps it's a desire to test the very limits of one's capabilities, or maybe it's a quieter, more personal quest for something lost or yet undiscovered within oneself. I had envisioned Denali as a place of stark, almost spiritual light and beauty, a landscape that could cleanse and clarify. I was selected for a specialized posting, a remote monitoring station deep within the park's interior, ostensibly for unique ecological data collection. I knew it would be solitary. I did not yet know it came with its own peculiar set of operational guidelines, rules that were not in any standard NPS manual. The final leg of my journey to Station 7, nestled in a rarely traversed valley on the north side of the Alaska Range, was by a sputtering bush plain that seemed to defy gravity more through stubbornness than aerodynamics. As we cleared the last craggy peaks, the panorama that unfolded was breathtaking, almost brutal in its scale. The Alaska Range itself was a massive wall of rock, glacial ice, and snow, a formidable spine bisecting the world. Below, the emerald hollow of the boreal forest stretched as far as the eye could see, a deep, ancient green. The pilot, a man whose face was a roadmap of Alaskan winters, pointed towards a barely discernible scar in the wilderness, the station. "That's her." He grunted over the engine's roar. "Good luck, Ranger. You'll need it." Stepping out of the plane, the air was the first thing that struck me. So cold it felt like a physical presence, yet so pure it was intoxicating. It carried the unique smell of snow, a crisp, clean scent with undercurrents of damp earth and distant pine. The landscape was a masterpiece of raw, elemental power, the vast scenery that makes you feel tiny by comparison. I could see for miles across, unmarred expanses of tundra and forest, a vista that initially sang of freedom. But as the drone of the departing plane faded, a silence descended, so profound it was almost a sound in itself, the surreal experience of total silence I'd read about. It was then that the awe began to curdle into something else, a nascent unease. The sheer, overwhelming scale of Denali, its ancient indifference, felt less like majestic beauty and more like a slumbering beast, its gaze fixed upon me, the insignificant intruder. This place, I was beginning to understand, was a land of paradox, inviting and terrifying, accessible and remote, welcoming and isolating. The beauty was a mask, a lure. The station itself was a small, sturdy cabin, built to withstand the worst Denali could throw at it. Inside, it was Spartan but functional. There was no welcoming committee, no grizzled veteran to pass the torch. Silas, my supposed superior according to the transfer papers, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, on the rough, hewn wooden desk lay a single, bound ledger. Its cover was plain dark leather, worn smooth with age and handling. The title, embossed in faded gold lettering, read, "Denali Station 7 Peculiar Regulations and Observations." My training had prepared me for a lot, but not for this. The paper within was thick, yellowed, and filled with typewritten entries, some supplemented by spidery, handwritten notes. These were not the standard park regulations I knew by heart. These were different. Denali Station 7 Peculiar Regulations 1. All reflective surfaces within the station cabin, as windows, mirrors, polished metal must be covered from dusk until full daylight. Verify coverage before nightfall. No exceptions. 2. The northern lights, aurora borealis, are not to be observed directly for more than 5 consecutive minutes. If whistling sounds, akin to high-frequency radio interference or faint human whistling, accompany the aurora, seek immediate shelter indoors. Do not look out until the sounds have ceased for at least 1 hour. Log any such occurrence. 3. Any wildlife exhibiting behavior contrary to established Denali patterns, e.g., unnatural silence from avian populations, herds moving in perfect, uncharacteristic synchronicity, predators and prey congregating peacefully, must be reported immediately via encrypted channel. Under no circumstances are such fauna to be engaged with or approached. Log entry format code Umbra 4. The ancient game trails leading towards the geological formation known locally as the Bone Pass. Coordinates appended are strictly off limits for all foot and vehicle patrols. GPS tracking units have historically shown anomalous readings and signal loss in this sector. These trails do not officially register on park maps. 5. Should you encounter man-made structures, cairns, or artifacts not documented on official park historical surveys or maps, particularly those appearing to be of pre-park indigenous origin, do not touch or disturb them. Leave a small, respectful offering of dried berries, tobacco, or a similar natural token sex as per traditional Athabascan custom, and retreat from the area by the most direct road. Document and report from a safe distance. 6. Under no circumstances are the names Gieg or Nahani to be spoken aloud. This prohibition is especially critical after dark, within earshot of running water, or during periods of unusual seismic activity. I read them again, a knot tightening in my stomach. The language was formal, almost bureaucratic, yet the implications sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. There were no explanations, no justifications, just stark, unequivocal commands. A final, typewritten note at the bottom of the last page ready. These are not suggestions, Ranger. Adherence is not discretionary. Your survival, and potentially the integrity of this sector, depends upon it. S. Blackwood, Sector Supervisor, retired. Silas Blackwood. So he existed, or had. The word retired felt ominous. These rules felt less like safety protocols and more like wards, a fragile set of instructions to navigate a minefield whose true dangers remained unnamed. It was as if someone, long ago, had encountered something here, something terrifying, and these rules were the desperate, codified remnants of that encounter, a corrupted, incomplete map of how to survive in the shadow of an unknown power. My first few days were a blur of settling in, establishing patrol routes, and trying to reconcile the breathtaking beauty of Denali with the unsettling weight of that ledger. The vastness which I had craved began to feel oppressive. The silence, initially a balm, now seemed to press in, amplifying every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind through the dense spruce that crowded the lower slopes. Sometimes, I'd catch a fleeting shadow at the periphery of my vision as I navigated the subalpine scrub, only to turn and find nothing but the wind-stunted willows. Was it an animal, or was the isolation already beginning to fray the edges of my perception? My training warned against letting the wilderness play tricks on the mind, but Denali felt different, imbued with an ancient, watchful presence. One evening, as the extraordinary Alaskan twilight began to paint the sky in hues of violet and rose, I was returning to the cabin. The light was ethereal, transforming the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. I glanced at the cabin window and saw my own distorted reflection staring back. Rule 1. A jolt, cold and sharp, went through me. I fumbled with the heavy blackout curtain, my heart thudding with an irrational urgency. It was just a reflection, I told myself. Just a rule. Later that night, unable to sleep, I stepped outside. The air was biting, the silence absolute. then carried on a breeze that seemed to spring from nowhere. I heard it, a faint high-pitched sound, almost like distant whistling, or the whine of an old radio searching for a signal. My gaze was drawn upwards, towards the star-dusted sky, half expecting to see the shimmering dance of the aurora. Rule 2. The memory of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I scrambled back inside, the wooden door thudding shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the vast emptiness. I didn't look out again that night. The whistling whisper on the wind a chilling lullaby. The rules were beginning to feel less like ink on paper and more like living things, their unseen teeth grazing my sanity, and the ledger of peculiar regulations and observations had become my unwelcome shadow, its typewritten pronouncements echoing in the vast silences of Station 7. The initial unease had solidified into a persistent, low hum of anxiety, a counterpoint to the raw, indifferent beauty of Denali. Each sunrise, painting the colossal peaks with alpenglow, that ethereal, fiery kiss of light on snow felt less like a new beginning and more like a temporary reprieve. The nights, even with the blackout curtains religiously drawn as per Rule 1, were the worst. The wind, a constant presence in the Alaska range, seemed to carry whispers that were not entirely of the elements, sometimes a high, thin keen that reminded me of the warning in Rule 2 regarding the aurora, even when the skies were clear of its spectral dance. Sleep became a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by dreams that felt too vivid, too steeped in the oppressive atmosphere of the station. I dream of endless, snow-filled corridors, of eyes watching from the tree line, of the ledger itself, its pages turning in a non-existent breeze, revealing new, more disturbing rules. The isolation, a companion I had once sought, now felt like a tightening vise, pressing in on my sanity. Was this the psychological hibernation? Some studies of polar isolation described an emotional flattening as a coping mechanism. Or was it something else, a slow erosion caused by this place and its secrets? I threw myself into the routine of patrols, the physical exertion a welcome distraction. My designated routes took me through a variety of Denali's ecosystems, the lower taiga forests, where spruce and birch grew dense, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The subalpine scrub, a tangle of willows and dwarf birch, and onto the exposed alpine tundra, where the ground was a carpet of hardy mosses and lichens, and the wind bit with an untamed ferocity. The ground underfoot often had a strange, springy quality, the permafrost lying just beneath the thin active layer. Sometimes my boot would punch through into muck overlying something hard and icy. It was during one such patrol, near the edge of a dense spruce forest that bordered a vast, open tundra, that Rule 3 slammed into my consciousness with chilling force. I'd been observing a small herd of caribou, their movements usually fluid and natural. Today, they were wrong. They moved with a jerky, unnatural synchronicity, their heads all turning at the exact same instant, their usually placid eyes wide and staring, not at me, but at some fixed point beyond me in the dense woods. Then, a profound silence fell. The usual chatter of ptarmigan, the scolding of squirrels, even the incessant buzz of insects all ceased. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. My skin prickled. This was the unnatural silence from avian populations. The ledger warned about. The caribou remained frozen for a long minute, then as one, they bolted, not in a panicked scatter, but in a tight, perfectly formed phalanx, disappearing over a ridge with an eerie, coordinated speed. My hand trembled as I keyed the encrypted channel on my radio. Station 7 to Denali Control. Code Umbra. Repeat, Code Umbra. Sector 4 grid reference. I described the caribou behavior, the unnatural silence. The voice that crackled back was clipped, professional, but I could detect an underlying tension. Acknowledged Station 7, log details. Do not investigate further. Maintain your current patrol parameters, but exercise extreme caution. Log details. I pulled out my field notebook, my fingers clumsy with cold and a sudden, visceral fear. The entry in the official station log later that day was terse, factual. But in the peculiar regulations ledger under Rule 3, I found a handwritten annotation by S. Blackwood. They see it. They know. Don't let it see you knowing. A A fresh wave of cold washed over me. The incident amplified my vigilance. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustle of leaves more sinister. The sheer scale of the landscape, which once inspired awe, now felt like a hunting ground, and I the prey. I found myself constantly scanning the tree lines, the distant ridges, my senses stretched taut. The big nature I'd read about in a ranger's blog felt less like an embrace and more like the gaping maw of something ancient and predatory. A few days later, my patrol route took me near the coordinates appended to Rule 4, the Bone Pass. The rule was explicit, strictly off limits. The official park map showed nothing remarkable in this sector, just another fold in the rugged terrain. But the ledger mentioned anomalous GPS readings and signal loss. Curiosity, that dangerous human trait, gnawed at me. I didn't enter the pass itself, but I climbed a nearby ridge that offered a vantage point. The air here felt different, heavier, charged. My GPS unit, which had been functioning perfectly, flickered and died. The radio emitted a burst of static, then silence. From the ridge, I could see the entrance to the Bone Pass. It wasn't a pass in the conventional sense, more like a jagged wound in the mountainside, a narrow, shadowed defile choked with scree and ancient, twisted pines. The rocks on either side were a stark, bleached white, like weathered bones, which I suppose gave the pass its name. There was a palpable sense of desolation, of a place shunned by light and life. Even from a distance, I felt a primal urge to retreat. I remembered Blackwood's note on another rule. Some places remember, some places wait. I didn't linger. I replaced the GPS batteries later, they were fine. The unit powered up as if nothing had happened. The most unsettling encounter, however, came a week later, deep in a rarely visited section of the northern foothills. I stumbled upon it unexpectedly, a small, circular clearing, and in its center, a cairn of stones. It wasn't a trail marker, it was too deliberate, too ritualistic. The stones were dark, river-smoothed, and arranged with an undeniable intentionality. It wasn't on any park survey. This was precisely what Rule 5 described. Man-made structures, not documented, particularly those appearing to be of pre-park, indigenous origin. My heart hammered. The rule was clear: do not touch or disturb them. Leave a small, respectful offering and retreat. I had a small pouch of dried berries in my pack, part of my emergency rations. With trembling hands, I placed a few at the base of the cairn, as per the Athabascan custom mentioned in the rule. As I did, I felt a distinct drop in temperature, a prickling on my skin, as if unseen eyes were watching. The silence here was different from the Code Umbra silence. This was older, heavier, imbued with a sense of ancient reverence and a potent, slumbering power. I backed away slowly, then turned and retreated by the most direct route. The image of the cairn burned into my mind. I logged the incident, the coordinates, the offering. Blackwood's note for Rule 5 was chillingly simple. They are still tended. They are still sacred. Do not presume. The names. Rule 6. Under no circumstances are the names Gieg or Nahani to be spoken aloud. I'd researched them discreetly in some of the anthropological texts I had. Gieg. Nahani. Spirits, or perhaps something more from Athabascan lore. The Nahani were sometimes referred to as woodsmen, spirits of those lost in the forest. Gieg was an infamous bad spirit, one whose very thought could cause sickness. The prohibition against speaking their names, especially after dark or near running water, felt like a desperate ward against summoning something terrible. The Koyukon people, whose ancestral lands these were, held deep beliefs about the spirits of the land, of animals, of the mountains themselves. Denali, the Great One, was not just a mountain, it was a presence, a power. One evening, while reviewing the station's geological surveys, trying to distract myself, a tremor ran through the cabin. It was slight, but unmistakable. Denali is a seismically active area. The lamp on the desk rattled. And in that instant, unbidden, one of the forbidden names flashed through my mind. I didn't speak it, but the mere thought, coupled with the tremor and the encroaching darkness, sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I found myself glancing at the door, half expecting to see it bulge inward. The ledger was becoming more than a set of rules. It was a chronicle of fear, a testament to something ancient and malevolent that resided in the heart of Denali. And I, Elias Vance, was now its keeper, bound by its warnings, haunted by its implications, alone in the vast, watchful wilderness. The weight of that knowledge, of those unseen eyes, was a burden heavier than any mountain, and the solitude of Station 7 was no longer a quiet companion, but a whispering tormentor. Weeks bled into a monotonous cycle of patrols, log entries, and the increasingly oppressive weight of the peculiar regulations. The vast, indifferent wilderness of Denali, once a landscape I sought for its stark beauty, now felt like a meticulously crafted prison, its boundaries defined not by fences, but by fear and the cryptic warnings in Silas Blackwood's ledger. My sleep was a tapestry of fractured images, the unnatural stillness of the Code Umbra, Caribou, the distant bone, white maw of the Forbidden Pass, and the knowing, ancient eyes I sometimes felt watching from the dense spruce forests that clawed up the mountainsides. The psychological toll of extreme isolation, the kind I'd read about in studies of polar expeditions, was beginning to manifest in ways my training hadn't fully prepared me for. Was it paranoia, or was Denali itself an active participant in this slow unraveling? The rules, once just ink on yellowed paper, now felt like sentient entities, their presence palpable in the small cabin. Rule 1, the covering of reflective surfaces, became an obsessive ritual. One evening, distracted by a flickering in the radio receiver, I was late drawing the thick blackout curtain over the main window. For a fleeting second, as the last vestiges of the Alaskan twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I caught my reflection. But behind my shoulder, deeper in the glass, something else seemed to shift, a flicker of movement, too tall, too gaunt to be an animal, too quick to be a trick of the fading light. I slammed the curtain across, my breath catching in my throat, the image seared into my mind. I spent the rest of that night with my back to the wall, every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind amplified 100-fold. Blackwood's scrawled addendum to Rule 1 read, "They see out. Don't let them see in. What looks back is not always you." The aurora borealis, when it appeared, was no longer a celestial wonder, but a harbinger of dread. One particularly active night, the sky wreathed with curtains of green and violet light. Then came the whistling, as Rule 2 warned faint at first, like high-frequency interference, then growing more distinct, almost melodic, but utterly devoid of human warmth. It seemed to emanate not from the sky, but from the air itself, from the very fabric of the silence around the station. I retreated indoors, heart pounding, the sound seeming to probe at the cabin walls. I pressed my ear to the door, a foolish act, and heard, or thought I heard, something brush against the exterior wood, a sound like dry leaves skittering, though there were no deciduous trees close enough to account for it. The log entry for Rule 2 from Blackwood was stark. The lights danced to their tune. The whistling is their call. Don't answer. My patrols became exercises in heightened, almost painful awareness. The vast, unmarred expanses of tundra, covered in a carpet of hardy mosses and lichens that felt springy and strange underfoot due to the permafrost just inches below, felt less like open space and more like an exposed stage. The silence of the wilderness, sometimes so profound it was a physical presence, would occasionally be broken by the distant thunder of glacier calving or the eerie creak and groan of trees in the wind, sounds that seemed to carry their own unsettling narratives in this isolated place. I found myself meticulously documenting every anomaly, my field notes becoming a mirror of the peculiar regulations ledger. Another Code Umbra event occurred near a glacial river, its waters milky with rock flour. A lone wolf, usually a creature of wary intelligence, stood stock still on the opposite bank, its gaze fixed on a point high on the mountainside, its body rigid, emitting a low, continuous growl that was more fear than aggression. Then, like the caribou, it vanished, not with the fluid grace of its kind, but with a sudden, jerky movement, as if snatched away. The ledger became my obsession. I pored over Blackwood's entries, his handwriting growing more erratic, more desperate in the later pages. He wrote of previous rangers at Station 7, some of whom had simply walked away, their gear left behind, their entries in the official logs ceasing abruptly. One entry, heavily underlined, spoke of the sounds. The land here has a voice, not just wind or water. It remembers. It calls. Some hear it more clearly than others. This resonated deeply with the Athabascan beliefs I'd researched. The idea that the land, the mountains, even the trees and streams possessed spirits. Denali, the Great One, was not just a geographical feature, it was a powerful entity, a sacred place with its own stories and its own guardians. Rule 6, the prohibition against speaking the names Gieg or Nahani, weighed heavily on my mind. Gieg, the bad spirit whose very thought could cause sickness. Nahani, the woodsman, spirits of those lost. The Athabascan people understood the power of names, of words spoken in places of power. One night, a particularly violent tremor shook the cabin. The Denali fault system was a restless giant beneath us. In the disoriented moments that followed, the name Gieg surfaced in my thoughts, unbidden and sharp. A wave of nausea and inexplicable dread washed over me. The oil lamp flickered violently, casting dancing, monstrous shadows, and for a terrifying instant, I thought I saw a face in the wavering flame, eyes burning with cold malice. The Bone Pass. Rule 4. Its coordinates were burned into my memory. Blackwood's notes on this were more fragmented, almost unhinged. Not a pass. A door. Older than the mountains. They don't use maps. He'd included a crude sketch, not of a trail, but of what looked like a symbol, a spiral turning inward. I found myself drawn to the official park maps, comparing them to the off-limits coordinates, searching for any hint, any geological anomaly that might explain the dread associated with the place. The area was depicted as unremarkable, just another fold in the colossal Alaska range. Yet the pull of it, the need to understand, grew stronger with each passing day, a dangerous counterpoint to the explicit warning. My radio, my only link to the outside world, became both a comfort and a source of anxiety. Sometimes, the encrypted channel would crackle with static, and I'd hear faint, distorted voices, too garbled to understand, not listed on any official NPS frequency. Were they other isolated personnel, atmospheric tricks, or something else? The Park Service archives mentioned strange disappearances and unexplained events in Denali's history, stories that once seemed like remote curiosities, but now felt chillingly relevant. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the tundra, I found a loose floorboard beneath Blackwood's old bunk. Prying it up, I discovered a small oilskin-wrapped package. Inside was a tarnished silver locket and a single folded piece of paper. The paper contained a list of dates, and beside each, a single spidery word awake. Watching. Hungry. Calling. The last date was only a few years prior, followed by a hastily scrawled, almost illegible sentence. It knows my name now. The pass is open. A cold dread, sharper and more profound than anything I had yet experienced, pierced through me. The rules were not just precautions, they were a failing defense. Blackwood hadn't just retired. He had become another story in the ledger, another whisper in the wind. And the cycle, whatever it was, seemed to be turning again. The wind picked up outside, howling around the eaves of the cabin like a mournful chorus, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my time of passive observation was coming to an end. Denali was no longer just watching, it was waiting. The discovery of Silas Blackwood's hidden cache, the tarnished locket, and the chilling, one-word entries culminating in, "It knows my name now. The pass is open," had irrevocably shifted my reality at Station 7. The peculiar regulations were no longer just a set of bizarre operational guidelines. They were a desperate, failing bulwark against something ancient and aware. Blackwood hadn't retired, he'd been consumed, another victim of Denali's deep, dark heart. The isolation, once a chosen companion, now felt like a hunter's snare, tightening with each passing hour. The wind, a constant voice in the Alaska range, no longer carried mere whispers. It howled with a predatory hunger, echoing Blackwood's final, terrifying pronouncements. The days that followed were lived on a knife's edge. Sleep was a luxury I could scarcely afford, and when it came, It was plagued by visions of the Bone Pass, its bleached, skeletal rocks beckoning, and a blackwood scrawled spiral turning endlessly inward. The psychological hibernation I'd read about in polar isolation studies was a distant memory. My senses were raw exposed, every nerve ending screaming. I found myself obsessively checking the blackout curtains. Rule 1, the slightest sliver of Alaskan twilight sending jolts of adrenaline through me. The memory of that fleeting, gaunt shadow behind my reflection was a constant, unwelcome guest. The radio became my only tenuous link to sanity, though even that was fraying. The encrypted channel, usually reserved for terse, code Umbra. Reports crackled with increasing frequency, not with official traffic, but with bursts of static and what sounded like distorted chanting, almost human but fundamentally other. Were these the voices Blackwood had alluded to in his ledger? The land here has a voice, it calls. The park archives mentioned unexplained disappearances, climbers and even rangers vanishing without a trace in Denali's vastness. These were no longer abstract historical accounts. They felt like imminent possibilities. One morning, the air was unnaturally still. The usual sounds of the boreal forest, the chatter of unseen creatures, the rustle of spruce and birch were absent. It was a silence more profound, more absolute than any Code Umbra event I had experienced. It felt like the entire park, from the permafrost-laden tundra with its springy carpet of mosses and lichens to the colossal, ice-sheathed peaks of the Alaska Range, was holding its breath. Then a low, guttural sound rolled through the valley, a sound that vibrated in my bones, not the thunder of glacier calving, but something more akin to a colossal sigh, or a growl. My gaze was drawn inexorably towards the coordinates of the Bone Pass. Rule 40 strictly off limits. But Blackwood's words, "The pass is open," echoed in my mind with the force of a summons. The ledger, my constant dreadful companion, lay open on the desk. Blackwood's final, almost illegible entry under Rule 4, reedy, "The trails don't lead out, they lead IN, to IT. The old maps lie. The new maps are blind." I knew then that my time at Station 7 was no longer about observation or adherence to rules. It was about confrontation, or perhaps surrender. The pull towards the pass was no longer mere curiosity. It was a compulsion, a dark magnetism. I checked my gear, ice axe, crampons, emergency rations, the encrypted radio I no longer trusted, and on a grim impulse, Blackwood's tarnished silver locket. I left the peculiar regulations ledger on the desk. Its warnings had failed its previous keeper. They would likely fail me. The journey to the Bone Pass was a descent into a primal landscape. The official park trails, such as they were in this remote sector, vanished. I found myself following ancient game trails, paths worn into the earth by millennia of unseen hooves and paws, leading towards that jagged wound in the mountains. The air grew colder, heavier. My GPS unit predictably went dead. The silence was broken only by the crunch of my boots on the scree and the pounding of my own heart. The rocks here were indeed like bone, weathered and ancient, some bearing strange, almost organic-looking striations. As I neared the entrance to the defile, the sense of being watched intensified. It wasn't the fleeting peripheral shadows I'd grown accustomed to. This was a focused, malevolent scrutiny. The wind, when it gusted through the narrow opening, carried a faint, charnel scent and something else, a whisper of names.
Gianhani?
Rule 6 screamed in my mind, but it was too late. The names were already in the air, in my head. The entrance to the Bone Pass was darker than any natural shadow. It felt less like a geological formation and more like a maw. As I stepped across the threshold, the temperature plummeted. The faint light from the overcast sky seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness within. The walls of the pass rose sheer on either side, composed of that same bone, like rock, but here it seemed to pulse with a faint, internal luminescence, revealing intricate, unsettling patterns that were not entirely natural, almost like a vast, fossilized script. I pushed deeper, the silence absolute, save for a faint, rhythmic dripping from somewhere above and a soft, almost inaudible scraping sound that seemed to come from the rock walls themselves. The air was thick, difficult to breathe, and carried that same faint, charnel undertone, now mixed with the metallic tang of something akin to old blood and the sharp, sterile scent of deep, ancient ice. Then I saw it. Not a structure, not an artifact, but a change in the very fabric of the pass. The narrow defile opened slightly into a small, circular chamber, and in its center, the rock floor was not rock at all. It was a dark, obsidian-like surface, smooth and reflective, despite the oppressive gloom. And on its surface, faintly glowing, was the spiral Blackwood had sketched. It pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. As I stared, mesmerized, a sound emerged from the spiral, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone beneath my feet and up into my chest. It was the sound of the earth itself, ancient and powerful. And from the depths of that hum, a voice, or something that mimicked a voice, spoke directly into my mind. It wasn't in English or any human language, but I understood it with a chilling, primal clarity. It spoke of hunger, of waiting, of cycles, and of names. It knew my name, Elias Vance. The locket in my pocket grew cold, so cold it burned against my skin. I pulled it out. It was vibrating in sympathy with the hum from the spiral. The last of Blackwood's scrawled words flashed in my mind. It knows my name now. The pass is open. The darkness in the chamber deepened, and from the edges of my vision, shapes began to coalesce, tall, gaunt figures, their forms indistinct, their eyes burning with the same cold, internal light as the rocks. They were the Watchers, the Guardians, or perhaps the extensions of the pass itself. They moved with an unnatural silence, their presence an overwhelming wave of ancient cold and alien intellect. I knew with a certainty that transcended fear that there was no retreat. The rules had been a fragile shield, now shattered. The wilderness of Denali in its most secret heart was not indifferent, it was aware, it was ancient, and it was hungry. The Athabascan legends spoke of Denali as the Great One, a place of immense power, a spiritual nexus. They spoke of spirits of the land, of mountains, of places that demanded respect. I had trespassed, ignored the warnings, and now the pass, the door Blackwood had written of, was indeed open, and it was calling me in. I am a ranger at Denali National Park, and I am walking into the heart of the mountain. Whether I will ever walk out is a story only Denali can tell. My name is Elias Vance. It feels somewhat strange to commit that to writing, even in a private log such as this, given the circumstances that now govern my days, and more pressingly, my nights. Professionally, my specialization lies in complex data pattern recognition. It's a rather niche field, involving the sifting of vast, seemingly unrelated datasets to find subtle correlations, predictive indicators, or anomalous outliers that might escape conventional analysis. A skill I was surprised to learn that was in high demand for this unique posting. The offer itself was, to put it mildly, too substantial to ignore. It arrived through channels I can only describe as discreet, following a period of professional uncertainty after the downsizing at my previous engagement at the university's astrophysics department. There, my work involved charting cosmic background radiation, looking for patterns that might hint at the universe's earliest moments. Here, I wasn't entirely sure what patterns I'd be looking for, but the remuneration suggested they were of significant importance. The need for a fresh start, coupled with a financial situation that was rapidly becoming untenable, made the decision, if not easy, then necessary. I signed the non-disclosure agreements, packed a single suitcase as instructed, and prepared myself for a new chapter, cloaked in government secrecy, and, as I would soon discover, a pervasive sense of the peculiar. The journey to the facility was an exercise in orchestrated anonymity. It began with a nondescript black sedan collecting me from a arranged, equally nondescript location in a quiet suburb of Las Vegas. The windows were tinted to an almost opaque black, affording me only fleeting glimpses of the neon-drenched city receding in the distance before we hit the open highway. After an hour, the sedan pulled into a featureless hangar at a private airfield. There were no logos, no identifying markers, just the hum of unseen machinery and the arid Nevada wind whipping dust across the tarmac. I was transferred to a small, windowless passenger jet. My two escorts, men in dark, unadorned suits who had introduced themselves only as Mr. Jonas and Mr. Smith, a cliché that did little to inspire confidence, were polite but utterly uncommunicative. The flight itself was short, perhaps 45 minutes, though without windows, my sense of time and direction quickly became distorted. Upon landing on what felt like an equally remote and unmarked airstrip, I was guided into another black vehicle, this one a robust SUV. This time, even the driver's compartment was separated by a darkened partition. The drive that followed was long and increasingly desolate. Through the windshield, I could see the landscape transform from scribbling to true, barren desert. Jagged sun-baked mountains rose in the distance, their peaks shimmering under the oppressive midday heat. We passed through no towns, saw no other vehicles. The only signs of human passage were the increasingly frequent security checkpoints. The first was a simple gate with a bored-looking guard. The next involved a more thorough vehicle search and a check of my supplied credentials. The third, set deep within a canyon, was a formidable affair with armed personnel, concrete barriers, and what looked like automated weapon emplacements. Each checkpoint served as a stark reminder that I was entering a place deliberately cut off from the world, a place that valued its isolation above all else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the facility itself came into view. It was not what I had expected. There were no gleaming towers or futuristic architecture. Instead, nestled at the base of a stark, flat-topped mesa, was a sprawling complex of low, windowless buildings. They were constructed from a dull, gray material that seemed to absorb the harsh desert light, giving the entire place a strangely muted, almost two-dimensional appearance. The perimeter was marked by an unnervingly high tech fence, topped with coils of razor wire and what looked like sophisticated sensor arrays. There was an air of profound stillness about the place, the only sound the distant, almost subliminal hum of what I assumed was a massive power generator or ventilation system. The heat was a physical presence pressing down, and the air carried a faint, sterile, metallic tang. My initial processing was as impersonal as the journey. I was led through a series of stark, white corridors by a new escort, a woman with a severe haircut and an equally severe expression, who introduced herself as Ms. Albright, head of personnel integration. My single suitcase was taken, its contents presumably to be scrutinized. I was photographed, fingerprinted, and subjected to a retinal scan. The silence of the place was unnerving, broken only by the click of Ms. Albright's heels on the polished concrete floor and the quiet hiss of automated doors. The few other personnel I glimpsed in the corridors moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes rarely meeting mine. There was a pervasive sense of watchfulness, as if the walls themselves were observing. The final stage of my induction was the orientation briefing, held in a small, windowless room furnished only with a table and 2 chairs. Ms. Albright sat opposite me, a thin file folder open before her. Her voice was a monotone devoid of inflection as she outlined the general terms of my employment, most of which I already knew. Then she slid a laminated card across the table. "These are the initial operational protocols, Mr. Vance," she stated, her gaze unwavering. "Commit them to memory. Adherence is not optional. It is mandatory. The consequences for non-compliance are significant." I picked up the card. The heading read Facility Orientation Rules Initial Set. Rule number Directive 1: all personal electronic devices must be surrendered upon entry. No exceptions. Facility, issue devices only. 3 Corridor 7 Gamma is to be avoided between the hours of 2500 and 0400. No reason will be provided. 5. If you observe flickering in the Sector B overhead lights, do not make eye contact with your reflection in any polished surface for at least 10 minutes. 8. All food and drink must be consumed in designated mess halls. Never leave organic matter unattended in workspaces. $1 Ikataw, I read them again. Rule 1 seems standard for a high-security environment. Rule 8, while a little specific about organic matter, could be construed as a hygiene protocol, but Rules 3 and 5, they sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the facility's efficient air conditioning. avoid a corridor during specific hours with no reason given, avoid eye contact with reflections if the lights flickered. This was beyond any standard security or safety procedure I had ever encountered. The bureaucratic, matter-of-fact presentation of these utterly bizarre instructions was perhaps the most unsettling part. It implied that these were not suggestions, not quirks, but established, necessary components of existing here. The very structure of the rules, presented so formally, created a jarring contrast with their irrational content, a contrast that hinted at an underlying reality far stranger than I'd prepared myself for. Are there clarifications available for these? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Ms. Albright's expression did not change. The protocols are self-explanatory, Mr. Vance. Understanding their necessity is not a prerequisite for compliance. Her tone left no room for further questions. The clear implication was that the system here was absolute, and my role was to fit within it, not to question its foundations. My first few days were a blur of settling into my small, functional living quarters and familiarizing myself with the equally functional, though far more complex, data systems I was assigned to. The work itself was intriguing in a detached sort of way, analyzing atmospheric particulate data, seismic readings from deep within the Earth, and complex energy signatures of unknown origin. But always, at the back of my mind were the rules. The first incident occurred on my third night. I was working late in my assigned lab module, trying to get a handle on a particularly dense data set. My workstation was located at the end of a long corridor, not far from an intersection. Lost in thought, I pushed back my chair, intending to stretch my legs and perhaps find a water fountain. I glanced at my facility, issued chronometer 0152. I vaguely recalled Corridor 7, Gamma being somewhere to my left. As I stepped out of my lab, I turned left, taking a few absent-minded steps down the intersecting hallway. A figure materialized from the shadows further down, a security guard, moving with an unnerving silence. He was tall and bulky, his features obscured by the dim lighting, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. Even from a distance, they seemed to reflect the minimal light with an unnatural intensity, almost like an animal's. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. He simply stood there, blocking my path, a silent, imposing sentinel. A sudden, cold realization washed over me. This was Corridor 7 Gamma, and the time was rapidly approaching 0200. I stopped abruptly. The guard remained motionless. I could feel a prickle of sweat on my forehead. My apologies, I mumbled, my voice sounding louder than intended in the oppressive silence. Wrong turn. He didn't respond, didn't even nod. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, the weight of his unseen gaze pressing into my back. It was a minor thing, easily dismissed as an overzealous guard or my own jumpiness in a new, strange environment. But the intensity of his stillness, the subtle wrongness in his eyes, lingered with me. It was the first concrete sign that the rules were not just words on a laminated card. They were threads in the fabric of this place, and to pull on them, even accidentally, was to invite a response. The seed of doubt, planted during Ms. Albright's briefing, had begun to sprout. This place was not just secret, it was fundamentally, deeply wrong. The weeks that followed my near transgression in Corridor 7, Gamma settled into a strange, disquieting rhythm. Life within the facility was a study in controlled monotony. The recycled air always hummed at the same low frequency. The artificial lights maintained a constant, shadowless illumination, and the meals in the designated mess hall, bland, nutritious, and invariably punctual, were consumed in a near universal silence. My colleagues, a collection of brilliant, but deeply insular individuals, were not unfriendly, merely distant. Conversations rarely strayed beyond the immediate demands of our work. Personal histories, hobbies, even opinions on the weathers, which we never experienced directly, were topics left unexplored, as if by unspoken agreement. We were cogs in a machine whose overall design remained opaque, and it seemed everyone preferred it that way, or had at least learned to feign preference. My work continued to be a dive into the esoteric. The datasets grew more complex, the patterns more elusive and, at times, more disturbing. I was sifting through telemetry from what were described as deep bore atmospheric sensors, but the readings often resembled biological signatures more than meteorological phenomena, fluctuations in subterranean magnetic fields that correlated with local wildlife disappearances. Strange rhythmic pulses of energy emanating from beneath the facility itself, pulses that the official documentation studiously ignored. I flagged these anomalies, submitted my reports through the secure internal network, and received only terse acknowledgments in return. No questions, no requests for elaboration. Just the silent ingestion of data into the facility's vast, unseen maw. The rules, however, never receded into the background. They were a constant low, level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily routine. One afternoon, while working in Sector B, a wing primarily dedicated to materials analysis, judging by the equipment I occasionally glimpsed through open lab doors, the overhead lights began to flicker. It wasn't a dramatic, power failure type of flicker, but a subtle, almost nauseating pulse, like a failing fluorescent tube. Immediately, I remembered Rule 5e. If you observe flickering in the Sector B overhead lights, do not make eye contact with your reflection in any polished surface for at least 10 minutes. My workstation monitor, currently displaying a complex waveform analysis, was a sleek, black reflective surface. The polished chrome trim on the desk, the darkened glass of a nearby instrument panel, suddenly, the lab seemed full of treacherous mirrors. I froze, my gaze fixed on a non-reflective patch of wall. The flickering continued, a sickly yellow-green throb. I could feel my heart rate increase. The urge to glance at my screen to see if the data stream was affected was almost overwhelming. But Ms. Albright's voice, flat and devoid of emotion, echoed in my memory. Adherence is not optional. I counted the seconds. Then minutes, my eyes darting around the room, carefully avoiding any surface that might betray my own image. Other personnel in the lab, I noticed, were doing the same. A woman across the aisle had her head bowed, staring intently at her lap. A man near the door was examining the scuffed toes of his shoes with an almost religious focus. No one spoke. No one acknowledged the flickering lights or the collective, silent adherence to the unseen protocol. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken tension. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to the prescribed 10 minutes, the flickering stopped. The lights returned to their steady, sterile glow. Slowly, cautiously, people resumed their work. The incident was never mentioned. It was as if it hadn't happened. But the image of my colleagues, all studiously avoiding their own reflections, was seared into my mind. What were we afraid of seeing? Rule 8, regarding organic matter, also had its unsettling manifestations. Never leave organic matter unattended in workspaces. It sounded like a simple hygiene rule, but its enforcement was anything but. I once saw a senior researcher, a Dr. Aris Thorne, a man known for his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail, accidentally leave half an apple on his workbench when called away for an urgent consultation. He was gone for no more than 5 minutes. When he returned, the apple was gone, not eaten, not thrown away, simply gone. Thorne's face, normally a mask of academic composure, went pale. He didn't search for it. He didn't ask if anyone had seen it. He just stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space on his bench, then meticulously wiped the area with a disinfectant cloth from a wall-mounted dispenser, his movements stiff and precise. Later that day, I saw him being escorted by 2 security personnel towards Ms. Albright's office. He looked shaken. I never saw Dr. Thorne in the mess hall or the labs again. His workstation was cleared out by the next morning, his projects silently reassigned. The swiftness and silence of his disappearance were more chilling than any overt punishment could have been. New rules would occasionally appear, delivered via the internal messaging system, always brief, always without explanation. One morning, a new directive was added to our individual access cards, Rule 11T. If you hear humming or whispered vocalizations from ventilation shafts, do not acknowledge them. Increase ambient noise levels in your immediate vicinity, if possible, e.g., activate non-essential equipment. The casual mention of whispered vocalizations was profoundly disturbing. Were they auditory hallucinations, a known side effect of something in the recycled air, or something else? The ambiguity was a form of psychological torture. The isolation began to wear on me. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the shift changes in the sterile routine, the lack of genuine human connection, the constant vigilance required to navigate the rules, the unsettling nature of my work. It all conspired to create a pervasive sense of unease. I started to notice things, or perhaps imagine them. The way shadows seemed to linger a moment too long in the corners of my vision. A faint, almost inaudible skittering sound from within the walls of my quarters at night. The feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. Was it paranoia brought on by the oppressive atmosphere? Or was the facility itself starting to seep into my consciousness? One evening, I was reviewing a particularly troubling data set. It involved a series of deep space transmissions that the facility had apparently been monitoring for years. The patterns were complex, almost mathematical, but interspersed within them were sequences that felt organic. Like a language, but one so alien, so utterly outside human comprehension, that it induced a profound sense of vertigo just to contemplate it. As I leaned closer to the screen, trying to isolate a recurring motif, my facility-issued chronometer beeped softly 01:58. I was working late again. Suddenly, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the floor, through the desk, into my very bones. It wasn't the usual thrum of the facility's machinery. This was deeper, more powerful, and it carried a strange, discordant undertone. The lights in my lab flickered violently, then dimmed to a sickly orange glow. My monitor went blank, then flashed with a cascade of cryptic symbols I didn't recognize from any known language or coding system. And then I heard it, from the main ventilation shaft above my workstation, a sound that was not mechanical. It was a soft, wet, dragging noise, accompanied by a series of faint, almost plaintive whispers. The words were indistinct, a sibilant chorus just beyond the threshold of understanding, but the intent behind them felt palpable, a cold, curious pressure against my mind. Rule 11 slammed into my thoughts. If you hear humming or whispered vocalizations from ventilation shafts, do not acknowledge them. Increase ambient noise levels. My hands trembled as I reached for the control panel of a nearby spectral analyzer, a piece of equipment I rarely used but which, when active, emitted a significant amount of white noise. I fumbled with the switch, my fingers slick with sweat. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. The whispers seemed to coalesce, to focus. I could feel a cold draft emanating from the vent, carrying with it a faint, charnel odor, like damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet. With a click, the analyzer whirred to life, its fans kicking in, filling the small lab with a rushing, broad spectrum hum. The whispers faltered, seemed to recede, drowned out by the mundane noise of the machine. The dragging sound faded. The lights flickered again, then returned to their normal, steady intensity. My monitor rebooted, displaying the standard login screen. The deep, resonant hum from beneath the floor subsided. I sat there for a long time, shaking the roar of the analyzer a comforting blanket. I didn't turn it off until the first hint of the scheduled day. Cycle, when the corridor lights brightened marginally. The incident was another stark reminder. The rules were not arbitrary. They were a shield, a set of desperate instructions for surviving in a place where the laws of nature, as I understood them, seemed to be selectively enforced, and where something ancient, something alien, whispered from the vents and pulsed beneath the sterile floors. The facility wasn't just researching the unknown, it was built on top of it, or perhaps within it. And we, the inhabitants, were living on the very precipice of its awareness. The incident with the whispers in the vent left an indelible mark. Sleep became a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by the imagined sound of dragging from within the walls of my quarters. My focus during work hours, once sharp and analytical, was now frayed, prone to distraction. I found myself jumping at unexpected noises, scrutinizing shadows, and reading the laminated rules card with an almost obsessive frequency, as if new, more terrible directives might spontaneously materialize on its surface. The facility, which had initially felt merely strange and secretive, now felt actively hostile, a place of lurking, unseen malevolence. My attempts to find patterns in the rules themselves, to apply my analytical skills to the very framework of my confinement, yielded little. There was no discernible logic, no common thread that could explain their bizarre nature. Some seemed to relate to specific times or locations, others to sensory input, and a few, like the infamous Rule 8 about organic matter, to almost ritualistic behaviors. It was as if they were designed not by a rational mind, but by a committee of madmen, each contributing their own particular brand of paranoia. Or perhaps, and this thought was far more chilling, they were reactions to phenomena so alien that human logic simply couldn't encompass them. One day, a new rule appeared on our internal terminals. Stark and unambiguous Rule 14 say, under no circumstances are personnel to attempt access to files or archives designated level Omega redaction. Attempts to bypass security protocols will be met with immediate and permanent reassignment. Permanent reassignment. The euphemism was chillingly familiar, a direct echo of what had happened to Dr. Thorne. This new rule, unlike some of the more esoteric ones, felt targeted a direct warning against curiosity, and of course, it had the immediate effect of making me intensely curious about what a level Omega redaction file might contain. My work involved sifting through vast amounts of data. The system architecture was something I was becoming increasingly familiar with. The temptation to probe, to just look, was a dangerous itch. It was during a routine data sweep, analyzing cross-correlations between deep, level seismic activity and unusual atmospheric energy fluctuations that I stumbled upon it. A data packet, flagged with a string of security protocols I'd never encountered before, and nested deep within a server directory that was, by all rights, supposed to be empty. Its designation, Omega Rapartel 734 Phenyl Radictide. My blood ran cold. This had to be it. Rule 14 flashed in my mind a neon warning sign, but the file was there, tantalizingly close, a digital ghost in the machine. My training, my very nature as an analyst, screamed at me to investigate. The potential consequences, however, were equally loud. I hesitated for a long moment, my cursor hovering over the file name. The logical part of my brain urged caution, retreat, but another part, a reckless, desperate part, fueled by months of suppressed questions and mounting dread, urged me forward. With a deep breath, I initiated a low-level access query, not attempting to open the file directly, but to retrieve its metadata creation date, file size, last access. Benign, standard diagnostic commands. The system responded, but not in the way I expected. Instead of the requested information, my screen filled with a burst of visual static, a chaotic, pixelated snowstorm. Simultaneously, a harsh, grating noise erupted from my workstation speakers, not the clean white noise of the spectral analyzer, but a raw, tearing sound, like fabric being ripped apart, or 1,000 voices screaming in unison, filtered through a broken microphone. The sound was agonizing, physically painful. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it seemed to resonate directly within my skull. The static on the screen pulsed in time with the noise, and for a horrifying instant, I thought I saw shapes within the chaos distorted, elongated faces, mouths agape in silent screams, eyes like burning coals. The air in my lab grew frigid, and the metallic tang I sometimes noticed in the facility's atmosphere intensified, becoming acrid and coppery, like old blood. Panic seized me. I slammed the emergency power off button on my console. The screen went black. The terrible noise cut off abruptly, plunging the lab into an unnerving silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of my heart. I sat there, trembling for several minutes, expecting security to burst through the door at any moment, but nothing happened. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Slowly, cautiously, I rebooted my system. It came back online normally, no trace of the static, no error messages. The Omega Rapartel 74 Radictide file was gone, not just inaccessible, but completely erased from the directory as if it had never existed. It was a clean, surgical removal, far beyond any standard file deletion protocol. The experience left me deeply shaken. It wasn't just the fear of discovery and permanent reassignment. It was the nature of the system's response. The static, the noise, the fleeting, horrifying images. It wasn't a standard security measure. It was a defense mechanism, raw and visceral, as if I had poked something ancient and terrible, and it had snarled back at me. What kind of information required such a violent, almost sentient form of protection? The incident also brought a new, more personal fear. Had they noticed? Was my transgression logged somewhere, waiting to be acted upon? Ms. Albright's impassive face floated in my memory. The thought of being escorted away, like Dr. Thorne, into the facility's unknown depths was a constant, gnawing anxiety. A few days later, another rule was disseminated. This one delivered on a physical, blood-red card slipped under our living quarter doors during the night cycle. Rule 17Z: if you encounter personnel exhibiting extreme pallor, dilated pupils, and a repetitive, soft-clicking vocalization, do not engage. Retreat to the nearest designated safe zone and report via emergency channel. Do not, under any circumstances, allow them to touch you. The specificity of it was terrifying. Extreme pallor, dilated pupils, a repetitive, soft-clicking vocalization. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario. This was a description of something they had encountered, something they expected us to encounter. The term safe zone was also new, implying that some areas of the facility were, by definition, unsafe. The red card itself felt like an omen, a stark departure from the usual sterile, digital dissemination of rules. It felt urgent, almost desperate. I began to see the other personnel differently. The quiet, insular scientists and technicians I worked alongside, were any of them close to exhibiting these symptoms? Was the pressure of this place, the constant exposure to the unknown, slowly changing us? I found myself scrutinizing faces in the mess hall, listening for faint clicking sounds in the quiet corridors. The paranoia was no longer a vague unease. It was a sharp, specific fear, a constant companion. The facility was not just a place of strange rules. It was a crucible, and I was beginning to fear what was being forged within its walls and within its inhabitants. The line between observer and subject was becoming terrifyingly blurred. The red card bearing Rule 17 became a talisman of dread. I kept it in my pocket, its sharp corners a constant reminder. The description of the afflicted personnel was so vivid, so clinically precise, that it felt less like a warning and more like an inevitable future. My observations of my colleagues intensified, bordering on obsession. Every pale complexion, every slightly too wide stare, every nervous tick sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The mess hall, once a place of bland neutrality, now felt like a gallery of potential horrors. Was the man across the table, the one who hadn't touched his food, and whose eyes seemed fixed on some distant point, merely tired? Or was he changing? The safe zones, mentioned in Rule 17, began to appear on the facility schematics accessible via our terminals. They were small, reinforced rooms, often located near major junctions or critical labs, marked with a simple green circle. Their sudden designation implied a growing instability, a tacit admission that containment, whatever it was they were containing, was becoming precarious. The facility's veneer of sterile control was cracking, and something was seeping through. My work, ironically, became my only refuge, the complex datasets a welcome distraction from the mounting fear. I was tasked with analyzing a new series of energy signatures, these ones originating not from deep space or beneath the facility, but seemingly from within the very fabric of the building itself. They were erratic, almost spastic bursts, correlating with localized temperature drops and strange, short-lived magnetic anomalies. It felt like the building was having seizures. I dutifully logged the data, noting the increasing frequency and intensity, but the reports, as always, vanished into the digital ether without comment. One evening, as I was walking from my lab module to my quarters, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clicking, like fingernails tapping softly on a hard surface. It was coming from a side corridor, one I rarely used, designated Sector 4, Delta, an area I knew housed some of the older, less used biological research labs. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule 17. Common sense, every instinct for self-preservation, screamed at me to turn around, to retreat to the nearest safe zone, to report. But a morbid, almost irresistible compulsion drew me forward. I had to see. I had to know if the horrors described on that red card were real. Moving with a caution I hadn't known I possessed, I edged towards the intersection. Peeking around the corner, my breath caught in my throat. Standing in the middle of the dimly lit corridor, facing away from me, was a figure in a standard facility jumpsuit. Even from the back, there was something profoundly wrong. The posture was stiff, unnatural, the head tilted at an odd angle. And the clicking, it was definitely coming from this person. A soft, wet, chitinous sound emanating from their throat. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of terror and fascination, the figure slowly turned. It was Dr. Albright. Or rather, what had been Ms. Albright. Her normally severe, controlled features were distorted into a grotesque parody. Her skin was stretched taut over her skull, possessing a waxy, corpse-like pallor. Her eyes, those cold, assessing eyes that had so unnerved me during my orientation, were now massively dilated, the irises almost entirely consumed by the blackness of her pupils, reflecting the dim corridor light with a flat, dead sheen. Her mouth was slightly open, and from it issued the relentless, soft clicking, a sound that seemed to burrow directly into my brain. She hadn't seen me. Her gaze was unfocused, directed towards the far end of the corridor. Her hands, held stiffly at her sides, twitched, her fingers clenching and unclenching in a spidery rhythm. There was an aura of profound wrongness about her, a sense that the human being I knew had been hollowed out and replaced by something utterly alien. Rule 17, do not engage. Retreat, do not, under any circumstances, allow them to touch you. The words were a lifeline. I began to back away slowly, silently, my eyes still fixed on the horrifying tableau. But then, as if sensing my presence, her head snapped towards me. The movement was too fast, too jerky to be human. Those vast black eyes locked onto mine. There was no recognition in them, no flicker of the stern administrator I knew. There was only a cold, predatory emptiness. The clicking intensified, grew louder, more urgent, and then she moved. Not walking, but lurching, her limbs moving with a disjointed puppet-like gait, yet with an unnerving speed. She was coming towards me. Panic, stark and absolute, finally broke through my horrified paralysis. I turned and fled, my boots pounding on the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the sterile corridors. I didn't dare look back. The clicking sound pursued me, seeming to grow closer with every step. I could hear her ragged, gasping breaths, punctuated by those awful, wet clicks. I fumbled for my access card, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it. The nearest safe zone was 2 corridors away. It felt like an eternity. The hiss of an opening door behind me told me she was gaining. I risked a glance over my shoulder. She was closer than I thought. Her pale face a distorted mask of hunger, one hand outstretched, her fingers tipped with what looked like sharpened, discolored nails. I reached the safe zone door, slammed my card against the reader. The light flashed green. The heavy door hissed open. I threw myself inside, mashing the emergency lock button on the interior panel. The door slammed shut with a heavy, reassuring thud, just as her pale hand slapped against the reinforced viewport. I collapsed against the far wall, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. Through the small, thick window, I could see her. Her face was pressed against the glass, her features contorted, those black eyes staring in. The clicking was a frantic, desperate rhythm against the viewport. She clawed at the door, her sharpened nails screeching against the metal, leaving faint white scratches. Then, as abruptly as it began, she stopped. Her head tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. After a moment, she turned and lurched back down the corridor, the clicking sound slowly fading into the distance. I stayed in that safe zone for what felt like hours, until the day. Cycle began and the corridor lights brightened. I reported the incident via the emergency channel, my voice hoarse and trembling. The response was a terse, automated acknowledgement. No one came. No questions were asked. It was as if encountering a clicking, transformed Ms. Albright was just another operational hazard in this godforsaken place. The encounter shattered the last vestiges of my denial. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were desperate measures against a tide of encroaching horror. The facility wasn't just studying the unknown. It was actively, and perhaps losing a strange energy signatures, the whispers from the vents, the redacted reports, the clicking horrors in the corridors. It was all connected, a tapestry of madness woven into the very foundations of this place. I didn't know what the ultimate purpose of this facility was, or what lay at its heart, but I knew one thing with chilling certainty: I had to get out. The alternative was to become another rule, another red card warning for the next unfortunate soul to be fed into the maw of the Nevada desert. I fear these may be my final coherent entries. The clicking has started to sound battle against it, and the personnel, myself included, were not just employees. We were bait, or worse, potential incubators. The cracks in reality were widening, and I could feel myself slipping. The data I analyzed. My name is Arthur Finch. Before the events I am about to recount, I considered myself a man of reasonable fortitude, not easily swayed by fanciful tales or flights of irrational fear. I held a degree in forestry, a field I chose not for a lack of other options, but out of a genuine, if somewhat solitary, appreciation for the natural world. For several years, I'd worked in various capacities for the National Park Service desk jobs, mostly involving land management reports and environmental impact assessments. It was stable, predictable work, but a quiet yearning for something more visceral, more immediate, had begun to take root. The advertisement for a seasonal fire lookout in the more remote sector of the Ashworth National Forest appeared on an internal job board, almost buried beneath a slew of administrative postings. It promised solitude, a unique vantage point of the wilderness, and, though unstated, a significant departure from the mundane. The pay was modest, but the allure of the experience was considerable. I recall thinking it would be an opportunity for reflection, a chance to disconnect from the increasingly clamorous modern world and reconnect with something more fundamental. My application was, perhaps, more of a formality given the scarcity of individuals willing to embrace such profound isolation. The regional supervisor, a man named Henderson, conducted my interview via a crackly video call. He was a portly man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold a permanent squint, as if constantly peering into a harsh sun. He spoke little of the day to day duties, which were standard for lookout weather observation, fire, spotting, radio check, ins. Instead, he focused on my psychological preparedness. "Mr. Finch," he'd said, his voice a low rumble, "this isn't a holiday camp. You'll be alone. Truly alone. Weeks can go by without seeing another human face. The silence out there, it has a way of getting under your skin if you're not the right sort." I assured him of my suitability, citing my background and my inherent preference for quietude. I omitted the growing sense of restlessness that was, in truth, a significant motivator. A week later, I received a terse email confirming my appointment. The start date was imminent. My predecessor, a man I only knew as Silas, was finishing his term and would be responsible for my initial orientation. The journey to the Blackwood Peak Tower, my assigned post, was an ordeal in itself. 2 hours on a paved highway, then another hour on a progressively deteriorating gravel road that eventually devolved into a rugged, barely discernible track. Henderson had arranged for a park ranger, a young taciturn woman named Jess, to drive me up in a battered 4x4. The final ascent was so steep and treacherous that I found myself gripping the door handle, my knuckles white despite Jess's evident skill. The forest pressed in on us, ancient and dense, sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy. When we finally broke through the tree line, the tower loomed before us, a skeletal finger of steel and wood piercing the vast, indifferent sky. It stood on the very precipice of the peak, a sheer drop on 3 sides offering an uninterrupted panorama of undulating forest, distant mountain ranges, and a sky that felt impossibly large. The structure itself was old, perhaps dating back to the 30s or 40s. 4 massive timber legs, braced with steel cables that hummed in the wind, supported a small, square cabin at the top, enclosed by a narrow catwalk. A single, steep staircase zigzagged its way up one side. Jess helped me unload my supplies, enough non-perishables for a month, water containers, propane tanks, personal belongings. Silas is up there, she said, gesturing with her chin towards the cabin. He'll show you the ropes. Radio in every morning at 0800, every evening at 1800. Any sign of smoke, you report it immediately. Any other issues, you report those too. There was a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation before other issues, a nuance I registered but didn't question at the time. With a curt nod, she climbed back into the truck, and with a final, gravelly roar, she was gone, leaving me in a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. The wind whistled through the tower's supports, a mournful, sighing sound. Taking a deep breath, I began the climb. The wooden steps creaked ominously under my weight. Reaching the catwalk, I circled the cabin, the view breathtaking and slightly terrifying in its immensity. The door to the cabin was ajar. Inside, the space was cramped but functional. A cot, a small table and chair, a wood-burning stove, and an array of meteorological instruments. Dominating the center was the Osborne fire finder, its brass and steel gleaming faintly in the dim light. And then I saw him. Silas was an older man, gaunt and wary, with a shock of white hair and eyes that burned with a peculiar intensity. He was hunched over a small, leather-bound notebook, writing with a sputtering fountain pen. He didn't look up immediately, and for a moment, I felt like an intruder. Mr. Finch, I presume, he said finally, his voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He closed the notebook with a decisive snap. Took your time. The road was rougher than I expected, I replied, extending a hand. He looked at it for a moment before giving it a brief, dry shake. His skin was like parchment. It keeps the curious away, he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Most of them, anyway. The next hour was a blur of operational instructions. The intricacies of the firefinder, the weather logging procedures, the radio protocols. Silas spoke in a clipped, matter-of-fact tone, but his eyes rarely met mine, constantly darting towards the windows, scanning the horizon. It was as if a part of him was always on watch, always listening. Finally, when he seemed satisfied with my grasp of the basics, he retrieved the leather-bound notebook he'd been writing in. He tapped its cover. Now, for the important part, he said, his voice dropping slightly. Henderson doesn't like to talk about these. Says it spooks the new hires, but you need to know. For your own good. He opened the notebook. The pages were filled with neat, spidery handwriting. These are the rules, Finch. Not Park Service regulations. These are the rules. The ones that keep you safe up here. I must have looked skeptical because his gaze sharpened. Don't dismiss this. Don't think it's some old man's ramblings. You follow these to the letter, or you won't last the season. Or worse. He began to read, and as he did, the wind outside seemed to pick up, its mournful sigh turning into a low, guttural moan. Rule number 1 at dusk. Ensure all shutters are closed and latched. Do not, under any circumstances, look out of a window after the sun has fully set, regardless of what you think you hear. If you must relieve yourself, use the bucket. Do not go outside. My brow furrowed. What if there's a fire at night? Silas's eyes, like chips of ice, fixed on me. There won't be. Not one you need to worry about seeing. If there is, the sounds will be your first warning. And trust me, you won't want to see what makes them. He continued, his voice a monotonous drone that did little to lessen the unease coiling in my stomach. Rule number 2. The radio is for official use only. Mornings at 0800, evenings at 1800. Report weather, report smoke. If you hear voices on the radio at any other time, especially if they call your name or speak of personal matters, do not respond. It is not Henderson. It is not Jess. It is not anyone you know. Who is it then? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, as if humoring him. It's the static, he said deadpan. The static likes to talk. Rule number 3, you will find a small, tarnished silver bell in the supply chest. Keep it on your person at all times. If you feel a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature not related to the weather, or if the air becomes unusually heavy and still, Ring the bell 3 times. Do not stop ringing until the feeling passes. Rule number 4. You may occasionally see lights in the valley below, moving in patterns that seem unnatural. Do not attempt to signal them. Do not investigate. They are not lost hikers. They are not looking for help. They are looking. Looking for what? Silas simply stared at me, then returned to his notebook. Rule number 5. If you hear scratching at the trapdoor to the catwalk, the one on the underside of the cabin, do not open it. It's never the wind. It's never an animal. It's testing the locks. A shiver traced its way down my spine. The cabin, which had seemed merely rustic a moment ago, now felt like a fragile cage. Rule number 6. Some days you might smell something sweet, like overripe fruit or cloying perfume, carried on the wind. On those days, eat only canned food. Do not consume any fresh water you've collected. The sweetness it gets into things. He paused, licking his dry lips. There are more. 13 in total. But these are the ones you need to memorize first. The others, they pertain to specific occurrences. You'll find them written here. He tapped the notebook again. Read it. Learn of it? He stood up, his joints creaking. My relief is due down at the base camp by nightfall. I'll take the old service trail. Faster on foot if you know the way. He gathered a small, worn rucksack. The keys are on the hook. Logbook is there. Supplies are itemized. At the door, he paused. One last thing, Finch. This place, it demands respect. It has a memory older than those trees. Don't get curious. Curiosity is a luxury you can't afford up here. Just do your job, follow the rules, and you might just walk out of here the same way you walked in. And with that, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the creaking stairs, swallowed by the wind. I was alone, truly alone. The silence he'd spoken of descended, vast and unnerving. I picked up the leather-bound notebook. Its cover was worn smooth with age and handling. The title, barely visible, was embossed in faded gold lettering. Blackwood Peak Observations and Admonitions. My first inclination was to dismiss it all as the eccentricities of an old man who'd spent too much time in isolation. Fire lookouts were known for their quirks. Yet, there was an earnestness in Silas's demeanor, a chilling conviction in his eyes that I couldn't easily shake. And the rules themselves, they weren't just odd, they were specific, detailed, and deeply unsettling. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red, I found myself glancing nervously at the shutters. Rule number 1. At dusk, ensure all shutters are closed and latched. With a sigh, I told myself it was just to humor the old man, to ease into the routine. But as I moved around the small cabin, securing each heavy wooden shutter and dropping the thick metal latches into place, a part of me felt a primal urge for protection, a sense of battening down the hatches against an unknown storm. The last shutter clicked shut, plunging the cabin into near darkness, save for the faint glow of my battery-powered lantern. The silence was now absolute, broken only by my own breathing, and the ever-present moan of the wind outside, a sound that now seemed to carry a different, more sinister cadence. I sat at the small table, the leather-bound notebook open before me, its spidery script illuminated by the lantern's glow. I told myself I was just being thorough. But as I read, a cold dread began to seep into my bones, far colder than the evening air filtering through the floorboards. The lantern cast flickering shadows that danced with the moaning of the wind, transforming the familiar shapes of the cabin into something more grotesque. I forced myself to focus on the notebook, its pages thin and brittle. Silas's handwriting, though neat, had a frantic quality to it, as if penned by a hand struggling to keep pace with a torrent of urgent thoughts. Rule number 7. I read aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. If you see a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, motionless, watching the tower, do not acknowledge it. Do not wave. Do not shout. It is not human, and it feeds on attention. It will eventually lose interest if ignored. Eventually, my blood ran cold. A figure. The thought of something inhuman, lurking just beyond the reach of my vision, patiently observing, was profoundly disturbing. I instinctively glanced towards the shuttered windows. a fresh wave of anxiety washing over me. Rule number 8, the old well partway down the service trail is not to be used. The water is not safe, no matter how clear it appears. Silas's note here was more emphatic. They taint it. They wait in it. I shivered. I had seen the well on my ascent, a crumbling stone circle overgrown with moss. It had looked picturesque then. Now it seemed a gaping maw into something unpleasant. Rule number 9, do not bring any reflective surfaces larger than your own palm into the tower. Mirrors, polished metal, even standing water in a basin if left too long. They can act as doorways. If you see something in a reflection that isn't there in reality, break the reflective surface immediately, regardless of the cost. I thought of the small shaving mirror I'd packed. It was definitely larger than my palm. A knot of unease tightened in my chest. What kind of doorways? And doorways to where? Rule number 10, if you find small, carved wooden effigies or arrangements of stones and twigs around the base of the tower, do not touch them. Do not disturb them. Report their presence to Henderson, using only the words ground unquiet. He will understand. He will tell you what to do, or if nothing can be done. The implication that some situations were beyond remedy was not comforting. Rule number 11, the wind sometimes carries voices. Whispers. They will sound like loved ones, or like your own thoughts spoken aloud. They are lies. They are designed to lure you out, to make you doubt your sanity. Trust only the silence, or the clear, unambiguous instructions from Henderson over the radio at the designated times. My own thoughts spoken aloud. The psychological aspect of these rules was perhaps the most insidious. How long could one endure such an assault on the senses and the mind before succumbing? Rule number 12. Never ever whistle after dark. Not a tune, not a signal, not even a thoughtless purse of the lips. It is an invitation, and they are always listening for an invitation. I wasn't prone to whistling, but the absolute certainty of the prohibition made my throat constrict. Rule number 13, if, despite all precautions, you believe something has entered the cabin with you, something you cannot see, do not panic. Do not speak to it. Light the wood stove, even in summer. Make it as hot as you can bear. They dislike the heat. And ring the silver bell. Continuously. The final rule. It was a contingency for utter failure, a last desperate measure. The thought of sharing this tiny, confined space with an unseen, malevolent entity made my skin crawl. I closed the notebook, my mind reeling. It was a litany of paranoia, a testament to a mind unhinged by solitude surely. And yet, Silas's conviction, Jess's hesitant warning about other issues, Henderson's own cryptic pronouncements about the silence, it all wove together into a tapestry of dread that was difficult to dismiss entirely. The first night was a torment of heightened senses. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind, every rustle of unseen creatures in the forest below sounded like a prelude to horror. I lay on the narrow cot, the tarnished silver bell clutched in my hand, my ears straining against the darkness. Sleep was a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by vivid nightmares inspired by the rules. I dreamt of scratching sounds of silent figures in the trees, of whispers that knew my name. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in pale, watery hues, it felt like a reprieve, a physical lifting of a great weight. I unlatched the shutters with a sense of liberation, the morning light flooding the cabin, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. The world outside was breathtaking, a vast, green ocean of trees under a clear blue sky. In the daylight, Silas's rules seemed almost absurd. My L800 radio check in with Henderson was brief and professional. Weather report, visibility, no smoke. Henderson's voice was its usual gruff monotone. No mention of anything untoward. I almost asked him about the rules, about Silas, but a strange reluctance held me back. What if he confirmed them? Or worse, what if he dismissed them and I was left alone with my growing fear, branded as unstable? The first few days passed in a semblance of routine. I meticulously logged the weather, scanned the horizon with the fire finder, and kept the cabin tidy. I explored the catwalk, the wind a constant companion, the sheer drop a dizzying reminder of my isolation. I found the small shaving mirror, and after a moment's hesitation, tucked it deep into my duffel bag. Out of sight, I located the silver bell in the supply chest. It was small, intricately carved, and indeed tarnished with age. I looped its leather thong around my wrist, feeling faintly ridiculous, yet obscurely comforted. I tried to rationalize the rules. The shutters at night. Sensible, perhaps, to deter animals or to conserve heat, though the latter seemed unlikely given the stove. The radio silence. Maybe to keep the frequency clear for genuine emergencies. The lights in the valley. Probably distant vehicles or campers, their movements distorted by distance and terrain. The scratching. Raccoons, or perhaps martens, common in these woods. But some rules defied easy explanation. The sweet smell and tainted water. The figures in the tree line. The injunction against whistling. These felt older, more primal, rooted in a folklore I didn't understand. On the third night, the first significant test occurred. I had just finished my 1800 radio check, in with Henderson. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. I was in the process of latching the shutters, a task I now performed with a certain grim diligence. As I secured the last one on the western side, facing the deepest, oldest part of the forest, I heard it. A soft thump, followed by a distinct, rhythmic scratching. It came from the trapdoor beneath the cabin, the one leading to the underbelly of the structure and the very top of the support legs. Rule number 5. If you hear scratching at the trapdoor, do not open it. It's never the wind. It's never an animal. It's testing the locks. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, listening. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. Scrape, scrape, thump. It could be an animal, I told myself, my mind racing. A large bird, perhaps, or a raccoon trying to find purchase. But the sound had a deliberate quality, a persistence that felt unnatural. And Celis's words echoed in my ears. It's testing the locks. I backed away from the shutter, my hand instinctively going to the silver bell on my wrist. The trapdoor was in the center of the cabin floor, a square outline barely visible in the gloom. It was secured from the inside by 2 heavy iron bolts. I could see them from where I stood. They were still in place. The scratching stopped. Silence descended, thick and heavy. I held my breath, straining to hear. Was it gone? Then a new sound. A low, guttural snuffling right beneath my feet. It was followed by a series of sharp, impatient sniffs. My stomach churned. No raccoon made a sound like that. It was too large, too eager. I found myself backing towards the cot, my eyes fixed on the trapdoor. The wood of the floorboards felt thin, fragile, the only barrier between me and whatever was down there. The wind moaned outside, a counterpoint to the terrifying intimacy of the sounds from below. The snuffling intensified, moving around directly under the trapdoor. Then, a heavy thud against the underside of the wood, strong enough to make the floorboards vibrate beneath my boots. I let out an involuntary gasp. It's testing the locks. I fumbled for my lantern, my hands shaking, and cranked up the brightness. The trapdoor remained still. The bolts remained secure. But the presence beneath it was undeniable. A palpable weight of malice and hunger. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The snuffling continued, punctuated by occasional thuds and more of that awful, deliberate scratching. I didn't dare move. I just stood there, a statue carved from fear, the silver bell cold against my skin. I thought of Silas's face, his burning eyes, his raspy voice. Don't dismiss this. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was, if possible, even more terrifying. Had it given up? Or was it merely waiting? I remained frozen for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall indicated only 20 minutes had passed. Slowly, cautiously, I edged towards the trapdoor, my ears straining. Nothing. Just the wind and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table, the lantern burning bright, the notebook open, though I wasn't reading. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind, sent jolts of adrenaline through me. The memory of the scratching, the snuffling, the thudding was seared into my mind. By morning I was exhausted but resolute. I would not be driven out by fear. I was a man of science, of logic. There had to be a rational explanation, a bear, perhaps. though what a bear would be doing trying to claw its way into a cabin suspended 50 feet in the air, I couldn't fathom. The 0800 radio call with Henderson was a lifeline. His gruff, ordinary voice was a balm to my frayed nerves. Morning, Finch.
All quiet?
Morning, Henderson.
Sector clear. Weather as per log, I managed keeping my voice steady. I didn't mention the night's events. How could I? Heard scratching, sir. Sounded like it was testing the locks. It sounded insane even in my own head. The next few days were a blur of heightened vigilance. I found myself constantly listening, constantly watching, even in broad daylight. The forest, once a source of solace, now seemed to hold 1,000 hidden threats. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every rustle of leaves to carry a sinister undertone. The rules which I had initially tried to dismiss now felt like the only thing anchoring me to sanity. And then, on the 5th day, the wind changed, and with it came the smell. Rule number 6, some days you might smell something sweet, like overripe fruit or cloying perfume, carried on the wind. On those days, eat only canned food. Do not consume any fresh water you've collected. The sweetness it gets into things. It started subtly, a faint, almost pleasant aroma mixed with the usual scent of pine and damp earth. But it grew stronger, a cloying, sickly sweetness that reminded me of rotting flowers and cheap, overpowering perfume. It was unlike anything I had ever smelled in the wilderness. It coated the back of my throat, made my eyes water, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lantern cast flickering shadows that danced with the moaning of the wind, transforming the familiar shapes of the cabin into something more grotesque. I forced myself to focus on the notebook, its pages thin and brittle. Silas's handwriting, though neat, had a frantic quality to it, as if penned by a hand struggling to keep pace with a torrent of urgent thoughts. Rule number 7. I read aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. If you see a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, motionless watching the tower, do not acknowledge it. Do not wave. Do not shout. It is not human, and it feeds on attention. It will eventually lose interest if ignored. Eventually, my blood ran cold. A figure out here. The thought of something inhuman lurking just beyond the reach of my vision, patiently observing, was profoundly disturbing. I instinctively glanced towards the shuttered windows, a fresh wave of anxiety washing over me. Rule number 8, the old well partway down the service trail is not to be used. The water is not safe, no matter how clear it appears. Silas's note here was more emphatic. They taint it. They wait in it. I shivered. I had seen the well on my ascent, a crumbling stone circle overgrown with moss. It had looked picturesque then. Now it seemed a gaping maw into something unpleasant. Rule number 9, do not bring any reflective surfaces larger than your own palm into the tower. Mirrors, polished metal, even standing water in a basin if left too long. They can act as doorways. If you see something in a reflection that isn't there in reality, break the reflective surface immediately, regardless of the cost. I thought of the small shaving mirror I'd packed. It was definitely larger than my palm. A knot of unease tightened in my chest. What kind of doorways? And doorways to where? Rule number 10, if you find small, carved wooden effigies or arrangements of stones and twigs around the base of the tower, do not touch them. Do not disturb them. Report their presence to Henderson, using only the words ground unquiet. He will understand. He will tell you what to do, or if nothing can be done. The implication that some situations were beyond remedy was not comforting. Rule number 11, the wind sometimes carries voices, whispers. They will sound like loved ones, or like your own thoughts spoken aloud. They are lies. They are designed to lure you out, to make you doubt your sanity. Trust only the silence, or the clear, unambiguous instructions from Henderson over the radio at the designated times. My own thoughts spoken aloud. The psychological aspect of these rules was perhaps the most insidious. How long could one endure such an assault on the senses and the mind before succumbing? Rule number 12. Never, ever whistle after dark. Not a tune, not a signal, not even a thoughtless purse of the lips. It is an invitation, and they are always listening for an invitation. I was prone to whistling, but the absolute certainty of the prohibition made my throat constrict. Rule number 13: if, despite all precautions, you believe something has entered the cabin with you, something you cannot see, do not panic. Do not speak to it. Light the wood stove, even in summer. Make it as hot as you can bear. They dislike the heat. And ring the silver bell continuously. The final rule. It was a contingency for utter failure, a last desperate measure. The thought of sharing this tiny, confined space with an unseen, malevolent entity made my skin crawl. I closed the notebook, my mind reeling. It was a litany of paranoia, a testament to a mind unhinged by solitude, surely. And yet, Silas's conviction, Jess's hesitant warning about other issues, Henderson's own cryptic pronouncements about the silence, it all wove together into a tapestry of dread that was difficult to dismiss entirely. The first night was a torment of heightened senses. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind, every rustle of unseen creatures in the forest below, sounded like a prelude to horror. I lay on the narrow cot, the tarnished silver bell clutched in my hand, my ears straining against the darkness. Sleep was a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by vivid nightmares inspired by the rules. I dreamed of scratching sounds, of silent figures in the trees, of whispers that knew my name. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in pale, watery hues, it felt like a reprieve, a physical lifting of a great weight. I unlatched the shutters with a sense of liberation, the morning light flooding the cabin, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. The world outside was breathtaking, a vast, green ocean of trees under a clear blue sky. In the daylight, Silas's rules seemed almost absurd. My 0800 radio check, in with Henderson, was brief and professional. Weather report, visibility, no smoke. Henderson's voice was its usual gruff monotone. No mention of anything untoward. I almost asked him about the rules, about Silas, but a strange reluctance held me back. What if he confirmed them? Or worse, what if he dismissed them and I was left alone with my growing fear, branded as unstable? The first few days passed in a semblance of routine. I meticulously logged the weather, scanned the horizon with the fire finder, and kept the cabin tidy. I explored the catwalk, the wind a constant companion, the sheer drop a dizzying reminder of my isolation. I found the small shaving mirror, and after a moment's hesitation, tucked it deep into my duffel bag, out of sight. I located the silver bell in the supply chest. It was small, intricately carved, and indeed tarnished with age. I looped its leather thong around my wrist, feeling faintly ridiculous, yet obscurely comforted. I tried to rationalize the rules. The shutters at night, sensible, perhaps, to deter animals or to conserve heat, though the latter seemed unlikely given the stove. The radio silence, maybe to keep the frequency clear for genuine emergencies. The lights in the valley, probably distant vehicles or campers, their movements distorted by distance and terrain. The scratching, raccoons, or perhaps martens, common in these woods. But some rules defied easy explanation. The sweet smell and tainted water, the figures in the tree line, the injunction against whistling, these felt older, more primal, rooted in a folklore I didn't understand. On the third night, the first significant test occurred. I had just finished my 1800 radio check, in with Henderson. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. I was in the process of latching the shutters, a task I now performed with a certain grim diligence. As I secured the last one on the western side, facing the deepest, oldest part of the forest, I heard it. A soft thump, followed by a distinct, rhythmic scratching. It came from the trapdoor beneath the cabin, the one leading to the underbelly of the structure and the very top of the support legs. Rule number 5, if you hear scratching at the trapdoor, do not open it. It's never the wind. It's never an animal. It's testing the locks. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, listening. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. Scrape, scrape, thump. It could be an animal, I told myself, my mind racing. A large bird, perhaps, or a raccoon trying to find purchase. But the sound had a deliberate quality, a persistence that felt unnatural. And Silas's words echoed in my ears. It's testing the locks. I backed away from the shutter, my hand instinctively going to the silver bell on my wrist. The trapdoor was in the center of the cabin floor, a square outline barely visible in the gloom. It was secured from the inside by 2 heavy iron bolts. I could see them from where I stood. They were still in place. The scratching stopped. Silence descended thick and heavy. I held my breath, straining to hear. Was it gone? Then a new sound. A low, guttural snuffling right beneath my feet. It was followed by a series of sharp, impatient sniffs. My stomach churned. No raccoon made a sound like that. It was too large, too eager. I found myself backing towards the cot, my eyes fixed on the trapdoor. The wood of the floorboards felt thin, fragile, the only barrier between me and whatever was down there. The wind moaned outside, a counterpoint to the terrifying intimacy of the sounds from below. The snuffling intensified, moving around directly under the trapdoor. Then, a heavy thud against the underside of the wood, strong enough to make the floorboards vibrate beneath my boots. I let out an involuntary gasp. It's testing the locks. I fumbled for my lantern, my hands shaking, and cranked up the brightness. The trapdoor remained still. The bolts remained secure. But the presence beneath it was undeniable, a palpable weight of malice and hunger. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The snuffling continued, punctuated by occasional thuds and more of that awful, deliberate scratching. I didn't dare move. I just stood there, a statue carved from fear, the silver bell cold against my skin. I thought of Silas's face, his burning eyes, his raspy voice. Don't dismiss this. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was, if possible, even more terrifying. Had it given up? Or was it merely waiting? I remained frozen for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall indicated only 20 minutes had passed. Slowly, cautiously, I edged towards the trapdoor, my ears straining. Nothing. Just the wind and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table, the lantern burning bright, the notebook open, though I wasn't reading. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind sent jolts of adrenaline through me. The memory of the scratching, the snuffling, the thudding was seared into my mind. By morning I was exhausted but resolute. I would not be driven out by fear. I was a man of science, of logic. There had to be a rational explanation. A bear, perhaps. Though what a bear would be doing trying to claw its way into a cabin suspended 50 feet in the air, I couldn't fathom. The 0800 radio call with Henderson was a lifeline. His gruff, ordinary voice was a balm to my frayed nerves. Morning, Finch. All quiet. Morning, Henderson. Sector clear. Weather as per log. I managed, keeping my voice steady. I didn't mention the night's events. How could I? Heard scratching, sir. Sounded like it was testing the locks. It sounded insane even in my own head. The next few days were a blur of heightened vigilance. I found myself constantly listening, constantly watching, even in broad daylight. The forest, once a source of solace, now seemed to hold 1,000 hidden threats. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every rustle of leaves to carry a sinister undertone. The rules which I had initially tried to dismiss now felt like the only thing anchoring me to sanity. And then, on the 5th day, the wind changed, and with it came the smell. Rule number 6 some days, you might smell something sweet, like overripe fruit or cloying perfume, carried on the wind. On those days, eat only canned food. Do not consume any fresh water you've collected. The sweetness it gets into things. It started subtly, a faint, almost pleasant aroma mixed with the usual scent of pine and damp earth. But it grew stronger, a cloying, sickly sweetness that reminded me of rotting flowers and cheap, overpowering perfume. It was unlike anything I had ever smelled in the wilderness. It coated the back of my throat, made my eyes water, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The smell intensified. It wasn't just a sweet scent anymore. It was heavy, cloying, almost tangible. It clung to my clothes, my skin, my hair. I tried breathing through my mouth, but its taste still seeped in. I remembered Silas's warning vividly: eat only canned food. Do not consume any fresh water you've collected. I looked at the rainwater barrel I'd set up in the corner of the cabin. The water in it looked as clear as ever, but with the pervasive smell around me, The thought of drinking it turned my stomach. My lunch that day consisted of cold canned beans and slightly stale crackers. It was a miserable meal, but the idea of ingesting anything that might be tainted by the sweetness was far more repulsive. Throughout the afternoon, the smell persisted. It gave me a dull headache and a queasy feeling. I tried opening a small window for ventilation, but the scent outside seemed even more concentrated, as if the entire tower was enveloped in an invisible miasma of the nauseating aroma. As the sun began to dip lower, I started to feel something beyond physical discomfort. The anxiety that had been gnawing at me for days sharpened into genuine paranoia. This smell wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a sign, a warning from Silas's rules, and those rules had a disturbing habit of being right. As I was about to secure the shutters for the night, as per my now ingrained routine, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the sill of one of the windows, there was a small, dark, sticky smear. It looked like thick syrup, and when I leaned closer, I caught that unmistakable sweet scent, but this time it was much more concentrated, as if its source was very near. It gets into things. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hastily closed and latched all the shutters, checking each one to ensure it was secure. The cabin was plunged into near darkness again, lit only by the faint glow of my lantern. The smell still hung heavy in the air, but now it seemed to have a more active, malevolent quality. I tried to eat dinner another can of sardines, but I could barely swallow. The thought that the smell might have permeated the food, even inside its sealed can, made me feel sick. That night, I heard no scratching, no snuffling. But I didn't sleep. I sat bolt upright on the cot, the silver bell clutched tightly in my hand, cold sweat trickling down my temples. Every shift of a shadow, every whistle of the wind, made me jump. The sweet smell was like an unseen roommate, taunting me with its presence. And then, around 2 a.m, I heard it. Not from outside, not from beneath the floor, but from inside the cabin. A dripping sound. Plink. Plink. It was so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then it came again, distinct and regular. Plink. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint its direction. It seemed to be coming from the corner where I kept the rainwater barrel. With a growing sense of dread, I slowly got off the cot, holding the lantern out in front of me. The light fell on the barrel. I couldn't see any leaks in its sides. Plink. The sound was coming from inside the barrel, as if something was slowly dripping into the water. I hesitated, torn between a morbid curiosity and a profound fear. Rule number 6 was clear. Do not consume any fresh water you've collected. But I had to know what was happening. Slowly, I reached out and lifted the lid of the barrel. The lantern light shone down onto the still surface of the water. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The water still looked clear. But then, as I peered closer, I saw it. A thin, iridescent film floated on the surface. It shimmered in the lamplight, and as I inhaled, I caught that cloying sweet scent again, but stronger now, as if concentrated. And then I saw the source of the dripping. From the ceiling, directly above the water barrel, a thick, dark liquid was slowly oozing, one viscous drop at a time. It wasn't ordinary water. It was thick and syrupy, like molasses about to burn. And as each drop hit the surface of the water in the barrel, it made that sickening plink and sent ripples across the iridescent film. I looked up at the wooden ceiling. The lantern light revealed that the boards there were damp and discolored, as if something was seeping through them. It gets into things. The realization hit me with full force. The smell wasn't just in the air. It was part of something tangible, something that was actively contaminating everything around me, including my only source of water. I slammed the lid of the barrel shut, a wave of revulsion and terror washing over me. I had to report this to Henderson. But what could I say? Sir, there's demonic syrup dripping from my ceiling. He'd think I'd lost my mind. But I had no other choice. I had to follow the rules. I picked up the radio, my hand shaking so much I could barely press the transmit button. I knew it wasn't a scheduled check in time, but this was beyond waiting. Blackwood Peak to base, I said, my voice trembling. Blackwood Peak to base. Does anyone copy? Only static answered. I tried again. Base, this is Finch at Blackwood Peak. I have an emergency. The static hissed. But then, through the noise, I heard a faint sound. A whisper, barely audible. It wasn't Henderson's voice. It was a voice that was chillingly familiar, a voice I hadn't heard in years. My mother's voice. "Arthur, my dear." The whisper was faint and gentle. "Everything is all right, son. Don't be afraid." For a horrifying, frozen moment, I almost responded. The voice was so perfectly hers, the gentle cadence, the loving intonation she always used when I was a child and scared of the dark. A wave of desperate longing washed over me, a primal urge to hear that comfort again, to believe it. "Arthur, it's me. Let me help you, son." Rule number 11, the wind sometimes carries voices. Whispers, they will sound like loved ones. They are lies. And rule number 2, if you hear voices on the radio at any other time, especially if they call your name or speak of personal matters, do not respond. It is not Henderson. It is not Jess. It is not anyone you know. My mother had been dead for 10 years. The realization struck me like a physical blow, cutting through the fog of fear and nostalgia. This was a trick, a cruel, insidious mimicry designed to break me. My hand, which had been reaching for the transmit button, recoiled as if burned. "No." I whispered, the word barely audible even to myself. "You're not her." The radio hissed, and for a moment, the gentle whispering stopped. Then a change. The sweetness in the voice curdled, replaced by an undertone of something cold and sharp, like splintered ice. "Clever boy, Arthur. But it doesn't matter. We know you're there. We can smell your fear. It's delicious." The voice was still recognizably my mother's, but twisted, perverted. A profound revulsion, colder and deeper than any fear I'd yet experienced, flooded through me. This thing, whatever it was, had taken something precious and defiled it. I slammed the radio off, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with an unseen, listening presence. The sweet, cloying smell in the cabin seemed to intensify, as if in response to my defiance. The dripping from the ceiling continued its relentless plink, plink into the tainted water barrel. I was trapped. The rules, Silas's desperate warnings, were no longer abstract guidelines. They were the flimsy barricades against a tide of encroaching horror. And those barricades were failing. My mind raced. Rule number 13, if, despite all precautions, you believe something has entered the cabin with you, something you cannot see, do not panic. Do not speak to it. Light the wood stove, even in summer. Make it as hot as you can bear. They dislike the heat, and ring the silver bell continuously. Something was in the cabin. The dripping, the voice on the radio, it wasn't just outside anymore. It had breached the perimeter. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm me. But Silas's words, "Do not panic," echoed with a desperate urgency. I fumbled for the matches, my hands slick with sweat. The wood stove stood cold and dark in the corner. I'd barely used it, the summer nights being mild enough. Now it was my only hope. Kindling, then larger pieces of wood. My hands shook so violently I could barely strike a match. The first one sputtered and died. The second flared, and I thrust it into the pile of dry tinder. A small flame caught, then another. Slowly, agonizingly, the fire began to take hold. As the first tendrils of warmth began to radiate from the stove, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The cloying sweetness, while still present, seemed to recede slightly, as if repelled by the growing heat. The dripping from the ceiling faltered, the plinks becoming less frequent. Encouraged, I piled more wood into the stove, heedless of the rising temperature in the small cabin. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. The air grew thick and hot, almost unbearable. But I didn't care. If heat was their enemy, I would turn this cabin into an inferno. Then I remembered the bell. The small tarnished silver bell Silas had insisted I keep. I fumbled for it, its leather thong still looped around my wrist. My fingers closed around the cold metal. I began to ring it. Not just 3 times, as rule number 3 dictated, for a sudden chill. Continuously, as rule number 13 demanded. The sound was surprisingly loud in the confined space, a clear, piercing peal that cut through the oppressive silence and the crackling of the fire. Clang, 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 clang. As I rang the bell, the heat from the stove intensified. The cabin was becoming an oven. The dripping from the ceiling stopped altogether. The sweet smell, though still faintly detectable, was now a mere ghost of its former potency. But something else happened. As the bell's clear notes filled the cabin, I heard a new sound. A low, guttural hiss, like air escaping from a punctured lung. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the very air around me. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice, of something ancient and enraged. The floorboards beneath my feet began to vibrate. The shutters rattled in their frames, not from the wind, but from some internal pressure. The lantern flickered wildly, casting lurching, distorted shadows. Clang, 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 clang. I kept ringing, my arm aching, my ears ringing from the din, but I didn't dare stop. The heat was becoming intolerable. I could feel my skin prickling, my lungs laboring in the superheated air. Then, a shadow detached itself from the far corner of the cabin, a patch of darkness deeper than the surrounding gloom. It had no discernible shape, but it pulsed, it writhed, as if composed of 1,000 smaller, squirming things. It flowed across the floor towards me, silent and inexorable. This was it. This was the thing that had been testing the locks, the thing that had tainted the water, the thing that had mimicked my mother's voice. Terror, stark and absolute, threatened to paralyze me. But the bell in my hand, the heat scorching my skin, the memory of Silas's grim determination, it all coalesced into a single, desperate surge of defiance. I screamed a raw, wordless sound and rang the bell with all my remaining strength directly at the advancing shadow. Ceiling! 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 The shadow recoiled as if struck. The hissing intensified, rising to a painful shriek. The shadow seemed to thin, to waver like smoke in a strong wind. It pulsed faster, then, with a final, agonized hiss that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the cabin, it dissolved, vanishing back into the deeper darkness from which it had emerged. Silence. A deafening, ringing silence, broken only by the roar of the fire in the stove and my own ragged, desperate breathing. The vibration stopped. The shutters ceased their rattling. The lantern burned steadily. The heat was still immense, but the oppressive presence was gone. The air, though scorching, felt cleaner, lighter. The faint, lingering trace of the sweet smell had vanished completely. I stood there for a long time, shaking uncontrollably, the silver bell still clutched in my hand. The fire in the stove began to die down, the intense heat slowly subsiding. I didn't dare move, didn't dare believe it was over. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, I was still standing, exhausted, filthy, but alive. The cabin was a wreck. Soot stained the walls, the floor was littered with fallen debris, and the heat had warped some of the wooden beams. The water barrel in the corner was still, its contents unseen. I didn't wait for the 0800 radio call. As soon as it was light enough to see, I unlatched the door and stumbled out onto the catwalk. The cool morning air was a balm to my scorched skin. The world outside was pristine, beautiful, indifferent to the horrors of the night. I didn't pack. I didn't retrieve my belongings. I left Silas's notebook on the table, open to the last page. I left the silver bell hanging on its hook by the door. I practically ran down the creaking stairs, my legs unsteady. I didn't look back. I half expected to see a figure at the tree line, or to hear a whisper on the wind, but there was nothing. Only the vast, silent forest. The journey down the service trail was a blur. I didn't stop at the old well. I didn't look for any carved effigies. I just kept moving, driven by a primal need to escape. It took me hours to reach the gravel road, and several more to stumble into the base camp, where a startled ranger found me, incoherent and babbling about rules and shadows. Henderson arrived later that day. He listened to my fragmented, hysterical account without interruption, his face unreadable. When I was finished, he just nodded slowly. "You did well to follow the rules, Finch," he said, his voice flat. "Most don't last that long if they encounter activity." "What was it?" I choked out. "What are those things?" Henderson looked out at the distant peak where the tower stood, a tiny speck against the sky. "Some places are old, Finch, older than us. They have their own inhabitants, their own ways. The tower, it sits on a sensitive spot, a thinning, you might say. He wouldn't elaborate. He arranged for my immediate transfer, citing acute stress reaction. There was no debriefing, no further questions. It was as if they wanted to forget the incident, and me, as quickly as possible. I never went back to Ashworth National Forest. I resigned from the Park Service shortly thereafter, the allure of the wilderness forever tainted by the memory of Blackwood Peak. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with noise and people, anything to drown out the silence that still sometimes echoed with whispers. I still have nightmares. Sometimes it's the scratching, sometimes the sweet smell, sometimes the feel of that cloying, viscous liquid on my skin. And sometimes I hear my mother's voice, gentle and loving, calling my name from the static. I don't know what happened to Silas. I don't know who, if anyone, replaced me at the Blackwood Peak Tower. Perhaps the rules are still there, in that leather, bound notebook, waiting for the next unfortunate soul. All I know is that I used to work in a fire tower with a strange set of rules, and I will never, ever do it again. Some doors are best left unopened. Some silences are best left undisturbed. And some places are best left alone,